Hi everyone, welcome to Red Umbrella. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to argue that Family Guy didn't just decline in quality like most long-running shows. It systematically destroyed everything that made it successful in the first place. Through three distinct failures, the show went from being a groundbreaking animated comedy that survived cancellation twice to becoming a cautionary tale about corporate greed and creative bankruptcy. First, the show committed catastrophic character Flanderization, transforming beloved characters like Peter Griffin from lovable idiots into unwatchable monsters. Second, it embraced creative bankruptcy by abandoning storytelling for shock value and lazy cutaway gags that even South Park called out as being written by manatees. And third, its own creator Seth MacFarlane mentally abandoned the show over a decade ago, while Fox kept it on life support purely as a cash cow, proving that profit matters more than quality in modern television. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free, and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999, right after Super Bowl 33. 22 million people watched that first episode. For context, that's more viewers than most shows get for their entire season today. The show arrived with a simple promise: give audiences an animated comedy that was edgier than The Simpsons, funnier than most live-action sitcoms, and willing to push boundaries that other networks were too scared to cross. The show's creator, Seth MacFarlane, was only 24 years old when Family Guy first aired. This matters because MacFarlane had never created a television show before. He didn't know what success looked like, and he didn't know what failure looked like either. Looking back years later, MacFarlane admitted that when the show premiered, he thought the whole experience was normal. Getting a show picked up on your first pitch? Normal. Getting millions of viewers? Normal. He had nothing to compare it to, which meant he approached the show with fresh eyes and genuine creative energy. The premise was straightforward enough. The Griffin family lived in Quahog, Rhode Island, a fictional town that served as the backdrop for their adventures. Peter Griffin was the father, an overweight man who worked at a toy factory and spent his free time drinking beer with his buddies at the local bar. His wife Lois came from a wealthy family, but chose to marry Peter anyway, becoming a piano teacher and stay-at-home mom. Their three kids each had distinct personalities. Meg was the awkward teenage daughter desperate for acceptance, Chris was the dim-witted but kind-hearted son, and Stewie was a British-accented baby genius obsessed with world domination and killing his mother. The family also had Brian, a talking dog who drank martinis and acted as the voice of reason. On paper, this setup wasn't revolutionary. The Simpsons had already proven that animated families could work in prime time, but Family Guy distinguished itself through its willingness to go places The Simpsons wouldn't. The humor was cruder, the references were more adult, and the show had a chaotic energy that felt genuinely unpredictable. That first season performed well. Family Guy finished 33rd in the Nielsen ratings, which measures how many households watch a show. For a brand new animated comedy on Fox, this was respectable. The network had struck gold with The Simpsons a decade earlier, and they were hoping Family Guy could become their next animated hit. But then Fox made a decision that would haunt Family Guy for years. For season 2, they moved the show from its Sunday night time slot to Thursday nights at 8 p.m. This might not sound like a big deal, but in television, your time slot determines your fate. Thursday at 8 p.m. meant Family Guy was now competing directly against Frasier, one of the most popular sitcoms on television. Frasier was a critical darling that regularly won awards and pulled in huge audiences. Putting a crude animated comedy against an established hit show was a death sentence. The ratings collapsed. Family Guy went from finishing 33rd in Season 1 to 114th in Season 2. Only 6.3 million people were tuning in each week, less than a third of the premiere audience. Fox canceled the show in May 2000, right after Season 2 ended. Here's where the story gets interesting. After canceling Family Guy, Fox received enough backlash from fans that they gave the show a reprieve. In July 2000, Fox ordered 13 additional episodes for a third season. This should have been Family Guy's chance to prove itself. Instead, Fox made things even worse. For Season 3, which premiered in November 2001, Fox scheduled Family Guy for Thursday nights at 8 p.m. again. This time, the competition was even more brutal. The show was now up against Friends, the biggest sitcom in America, and Survivor, the reality show phenomenon that was dominating the ratings. Both shows were cultural juggernauts. Friends regularly pulled in 20 million viewers per episode. Survivor wasn't far behind. Family Guy never stood a chance. Fox also kept moving the show around to different days and time slots with little or no warning. Imagine being a fan trying to watch Family Guy in 2001. One week it's on Thursday. The next week it might be on Wednesday, or it might not air at all. There was no DVR technology widely available yet, no streaming services, no easy way to keep track of when your favorite show was airing. If you missed an episode, you missed it. This constant shuffling killed any momentum the show had built. In May 2002, when Fox announced their fall lineup for the upcoming season, Family Guy was absent. The show had been canceled for the second time. One episode from season 3 hadn't even aired yet. It would eventually premiere on Adult Swim in 2003, but for all intents and purposes, Family Guy was dead. What made this cancellation particularly tragic was that early Family Guy actually had something special going for it. The show that aired from 1999 to 2002 was fundamentally different from what Family Guy would become later. Critics and fans who look back at these first 3 seasons often describe them as the show's most grounded era. Take the cutaway gags, which would eventually become Family Guy's most famous and most criticized element. In those early seasons, cutaways were rare. When they happened, they served the story rather than replacing it. The show focused on actual plots with real emotional stakes. Characters had arcs that meant something. Problems that arose in the beginning of an episode had consequences by the end. Consider an episode like Road to Rhode Island from season 2. In this episode, Stewie and Brian end up on a road trip together trying to get home. Along the way, Brian has to confront painful memories about his mother, who abandoned him when he was a puppy. The episode dealt with real feelings of abandonment and loss. Yes, there were jokes throughout, but the emotional core was genuine. By the end of the episode, Brian and Stewie's relationship had deepened in a meaningful way. Or look at Brian, Portrait of a Dog from season 1. Peter sends Brian to obedience school after Brian bites someone. Brian is humiliated by being treated like an actual dog, rather than the intellectual equal he sees himself as. The episode explored themes of dignity, respect, and what it means to belong to a family. When Peter eventually stands up for Brian and breaks him out of obedience school, it's a genuinely heartwarming moment. The joke about Peter calling MacGyver to help with the prison break was funny, but it was also tied directly to the plot. It wasn't a random aside that had nothing to do with the story. The characters themselves were more complex in these early seasons. Peter Griffin is the clearest example. Yes, Peter was stupid. Yes, he made bad decisions. But he also genuinely loved his family and tried to do right by them, even when he messed up. In one early episode, Peter explicitly says he would take a bullet for Meg. This is important because it shows Peter saw himself as a protector, as a father who would sacrifice himself for his daughter. This version of Peter was a bumbling idiot, but he was a well-meaning bumbling idiot. When he hurt people, it was usually because he was too dumb or too arrogant to realize what he was doing wrong. But the show would then teach Peter a lesson. By the end of most episodes, Peter understood what he'd done wrong and tried to make it right. He grew, he learned, he changed, at least temporarily. The same was true for the other characters. Lois was the responsible one who kept the family together, but she also had a wild past that occasionally surfaced. Meg was awkward and unpopular, but the family didn't actively hate her. They treated her like a normal teenage daughter. Chris was slow but sweet. Stewie was evil, but in a cartoonish, over-the-top way that never felt genuinely dark. Brian was intelligent and cultured, but also had real flaws and insecurities. What separated early Family Guy from what it would become was that these characters felt like people. Weird, exaggerated cartoon people, sure, but people nonetheless. They had relationships with each other that mattered. They had problems that weren't solved with time travel or magic or complete amnesia about what happened in previous episodes. The writing itself was sharper too. Instead of relying on shock value or gross-out humor, early Family Guy used wit and clever references. The pop culture jokes were more thoughtful. When the show referenced something from the 1970s or 1980s, it did so because the reference enhanced the joke or the story, not because the writers needed to fill time. None of this should suggest that early Family Guy was perfect. It had plenty of crude humor, it pushed boundaries and offended people. The Parents Television Council was already calling it one of the worst shows on television by 2000. But the crudeness and boundary pushing served a purpose. The show was trying to prove that animation could be for adults, that you could tell stories with real emotion while also being hilarious and irreverent. The tragedy of Family Guy's cancellation in 2002 was that the show never got the chance to find its full audience. It was a victim of bad scheduling, network mismanagement, and terrible competition. McFarlane later admitted that when he got canceled the second time, he thought that was just normal too. He figured getting canceled was part of the process, that he'd move on to his next project, and that would be that. For most shows, that would have been the end of the story. A quirky animated comedy gets a few seasons, builds a small cult following, gets canceled, and fades into obscurity. People who remembered it would talk fondly about how it was ahead of its time, or how the network never gave it a fair shot. Maybe it would get mentioned in articles about great shows that died too soon, but that would be it. Family Guy's story didn't end there. In fact, the show's death in 2002 was just the beginning of something unprecedented in television history. What happened next would change everything, not just for Family Guy, but for how networks understood their audiences and valued their shows. But that resurrection would also plant the seeds for Family Guy's eventual decline into everything it once stood against. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. What nobody knew in 2002 was that Family Guy had been building a secret army of fans who refused to let the show die. Section 2. The Miraculous Revival, 2002 to 2005. When Family Guy died in 2002, nobody at Fox expected to hear about it again. The network had given the show 2 chances and canceled it twice. As far as Fox was concerned, Family Guy had failed. The ratings were terrible, the show was expensive to produce, and there were plenty of other programs fighting for airtime. Fox moved on. Seth MacFarlane moved on. Everyone assumed that was the end. But something strange started happening during those 3 years when Family Guy wasn't making new episodes. Something that had never happened before in television history. After canceling Family Guy, Fox needed to do something with the episodes they'd already made. The network had invested millions of dollars producing those first 3 seasons, and that investment didn't just disappear because the show got canceled. So Fox did what networks typically do with failed shows. They sold the rights to air reruns to whoever would buy them. This is where things get interesting. Fox tried to sell Family Guy's rerun rights to other networks and cable channels. They shopped it around to anyone who might be interested, and almost nobody wanted it. The show had been a ratings failure on Fox. Why would another network want to air a canceled show that couldn't find an audience on a major broadcast network? Eventually, Cartoon Network's late-night programming block, Adult Swim, bought the rights. According to executives involved in the deal, Adult Swim got Family Guy reruns for almost nothing. Fox was so desperate to recoup any money they could that they basically gave the show away. Adult Swim started airing Family Guy reruns in 2003. Adult Swim was perfect for Family Guy in ways that Fox's Thursday night schedule never was. Adult Swim aired late at night, after 11 p.m., when parents weren't monitoring what their kids watched. The audience was primarily college students and young adults who were up late anyway. These were people who appreciated crude humor, pop culture references, and animation that wasn't made for children. The results were immediate and shocking. Family Guy became Adult Swim's highest-rated program almost instantly. The ratings didn't just improve a little bit, they exploded. Adult Swim saw their viewership increase by 239% when Family Guy aired. That's not a typo. The show that Fox couldn't get anyone to watch was suddenly tripling the audience for an entire cable network. Young people who had missed Family Guy during its original run because of Fox's terrible scheduling now discovered the show. They could watch it every night at the same time without having to guess when it might air. They told their friends. Those friends told their friends. Word spread through college dorms and online message boards. Family Guy went from being a canceled failure to a genuine cultural phenomenon, all through reruns. But the Adult Swim ratings were only part of the story. While the show was becoming a hit on cable, something even more unprecedented was happening in stores. In 2003, Fox released the first 2 seasons of Family Guy on DVD. At this point, TV shows on DVD were still relatively new. The concept of buying an entire season of a show to watch at home was novel. Most people were used to waiting for reruns or recording episodes on VHS tapes. Buying a DVD box set of a television show was a luxury purchase, something only the most dedicated fans would consider. Fox didn't have high expectations for the Family Guy DVDs. The show had been canceled. It was dead. Maybe they'd sell enough copies to hardcore fans to make back the production costs. That would be a win. The first DVD volume sold 400,000 copies in its first month. That alone would have been impressive for a canceled show. But sales didn't stop there. They kept climbing. By the end of 2003, the Season 1 and Season 2 DVD sets had sold 2.2 million copies combined. To put that in perspective, Family Guy DVDs became the best-selling television DVD of 2003. A canceled show outsold every currently airing show on television. It wasn't even close. Family Guy was moving units like a hit movie, not like a failed TV series. When the Season 3 DVDs came out, they sold over 1 million copies. A show that Fox had canceled twice was now generating millions of dollars in pure profit from DVD sales. And unlike advertising revenue from TV broadcasts, which the network had to share with advertisers and affiliates, DVD sales went almost entirely to Fox. This was money the network hadn't expected and hadn't budgeted for. Fox executives started paying attention. They pulled the numbers and realized something remarkable was happening. Family Guy had a massive, passionate fan base that Fox had completely failed to recognize or reach. The show hadn't failed because people didn't like it. The show had failed because Fox had put it in impossible time slots against unbeatable competition, and then kept moving it around so fans couldn't find it. But on Adult Swim, airing at the same time every night, Family Guy thrived. On DVD, where people could watch episodes whenever they wanted, Family Guy thrived. The show hadn't been the problem. Fox's handling of the show had been the problem. On May 20th, 2004, Fox made an announcement that shocked the entertainment industry. They were bringing Family Guy back. The network ordered 35 new episodes. A canceled show was being resurrected after 3 years off the air. This had never happened before. Shows got canceled and stayed canceled. That was how television worked. Sure, occasionally a show would move from one network to another, but that was different. This was the same network that had killed the show, deciding to bring it back from the dead. The revival was historic for another reason too. Family Guy became the first show in television history to be brought back based primarily on DVD sales. Fox's decision wasn't based on some artistic argument about the show's quality or potential. It was based on cold, hard numbers. The DVDs were selling millions of copies. Adult Swim was proving there was a huge audience for the show. Fox realized they had made a mistake, and they were willing to admit it and fix it. For Seth MacFarlane, the resurrection was surreal. He had already moved on mentally. He was developing other projects, including what would eventually become American Dad. He'd made peace with Family Guy being over. Now suddenly, he had to come back and make more episodes of a show he'd thought was finished. But MacFarlane was also excited. The 3-year hiatus meant the writer's room wouldn't be burned out. Television animation is grueling work. Writers typically work on a show for 10 or 11 months a year, churning out episode after episode with barely any breaks. MacFarlane later said that animated shows don't normally get hiatuses, and by the end of a long season, you see signs of exhaustion in the writing. The jokes get lazier. Writers rely more on easy laughs like sex jokes and bathroom humor because their brains are fried from working nonstop. The 3 years off meant MacFarlane and his team would come back fresh. They'd have new ideas, new energy, and a genuine appreciation for getting a second chance. MacFarlane said publicly that the hiatus was probably beneficial for the show's quality. The new season, Season 4, premiered on May 1st, 2005. The first episode was called North by North Quahog, and 11.85 million people tuned in to watch. That was almost twice as many viewers as the show had averaged during its original run on Fox. The episode itself was a celebration of the show's return. In the opening scene, Peter gathers the family in the living room and announces, "We've been canceled." He then proceeds to list every single show that Fox had put on the air to replace Family Guy during those 3 years. It was a long list. Peter rattles off names like Dark Angel, Titus, Undeclared, Action, That 80s Show, Wonderfalls, Fastlane, Andy Richter Controls the Universe, Firefly, Get Real, and dozens more. The joke was clear. Fox had tried replacing Family Guy with all these other shows, and most of them had failed and been canceled themselves. Some of those shows lasted one season. Some lasted only a few episodes. Meanwhile, Family Guy, the show Fox had killed twice, was back and bigger than ever. It was a moment of triumph disguised as a comedy bit. The meta humor didn't stop there. Throughout the episode, characters broke the fourth wall to acknowledge that the show had been gone. They referenced the fact that they were on a TV show, that they'd been canceled, and that they were back now. For fans who had fought to keep Family Guy alive by buying DVDs and watching reruns, it felt like the show was thanking them directly. Fox gave Family Guy something they'd never given it before: a good time slot. The show aired on Sunday nights right after The Simpsons. This was Fox's animation domination block, their most valuable programming real estate. The Simpsons was still a ratings powerhouse, and whatever show aired after it benefited from all those viewers sticking around. Suddenly, Family Guy had everything it needed to succeed: a consistent time slot that viewers could rely on, a lead-in from the most popular animated show on television, an audience that was already primed for adult animation, and most importantly, network support. Fox was promoting Family Guy heavily, running ads during football games and other high-profile programs. The network was treating Family Guy like a hit show, instead of an embarrassment. The ratings reflected this. Family Guy wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Episodes regularly pulled in over 10 million viewers. The show was consistently winning its time slot. Fox had struck gold, and they knew it. For the writers and animators, there was enormous pressure to prove the revival was worth it. They couldn't just make the same show they'd made before. They needed to justify the unprecedented second chance they'd been given. The writers tried to keep the show's core intact while also pushing the envelope in new directions. McFarlane said in interviews that the goal with Season 4 was to make Family Guy exactly as it was before the cancellation. The writers didn't want to change what had worked. They didn't want to reinvent the show or try to appeal to some imaginary broader audience. They wanted to make the same irreverent, crude, funny show they'd been making before Fox killed it. But there was also an understanding that the show needed to evolve. 3 years had passed. The cultural landscape had changed. The kind of humor that worked in 2002 might not work in 2005. The writers started experimenting more with the cutaway gags, making them longer and more elaborate. They leaned harder into the pop culture references. They pushed the boundaries of what Fox would let them get away with. This evolution would prove to be both a blessing and a curse. In the short term, it worked. The show was funny, fresh, and exciting. Fans were thrilled to have Family Guy back. Critics, many of whom had dismissed the show during its original run, started paying attention and giving it more respect. But the seeds of future problems were already being planted. The cutaways were getting longer. The show was becoming more reliant on random jokes that had nothing to do with the plot. Characters were starting to become more exaggerated versions of themselves. The balance between heart and humor that had defined early Family Guy was beginning to tip toward pure comedy, consequences be damned. None of this was obvious in 2005. At the time, Family Guy's resurrection felt like an unambiguous victory. A good show had been killed by network incompetence, and now it was back where it belonged. Fans were happy. Fox was making money. McFarlane and his team were employed and creatively fulfilled. Everyone won. What nobody realized was that the very thing that saved Family Guy would also doom it. Fox had brought the show back because it made money, not because they believed in it artistically. As long as Family Guy generated revenue through ratings and DVD sales, Fox would keep it on the air. Quality wouldn't matter. Creative vision wouldn't matter. All that would matter was whether the show continued to be profitable. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. This arrangement would work perfectly fine for a while, particularly during the show's second golden age that was just beginning. Section 3, The Golden Age, Seasons 4 to 8, 2005 to 2009. After Family Guy returned in 2005, something magical happened. For the next 4 years, the show hit its creative peak. This period, covering Season 4 through the early part of Season 8, is what fans and critics now consider Family Guy's golden age. This was the show firing on all cylinders, delivering everything people loved about it, without the problems that would eventually drag it down. The numbers tell part of the story. Family Guy was averaging around 7.9 million viewers per episode during these years. That might not sound massive compared to juggernauts like American Idol or CSI, but for an animated comedy on Sunday nights, those were excellent ratings. Fox was thrilled. After spending years trying to figure out what to do with Family Guy, they finally had a genuine hit on their hands. But the ratings only explain why Fox kept the show on the air. What made this era special was the quality of the episodes themselves. The writers had found the perfect balance between heart and humor, between storytelling and randomness, between pushing boundaries and maintaining some kind of emotional core. The show's new Sunday night time slot after The Simpsons gave Family Guy stability it had never enjoyed before. Fans knew exactly when to watch. Every Sunday at the same time, Family Guy would be there. This consistency allowed the show to build momentum. People could plan their evenings around it. College students would gather in dorms to watch together. Families who didn't mind the crude humor would make it part of their Sunday routine. During this golden age, Family Guy developed several running elements that became signatures of the show's success. The most beloved were the Road 2 episodes featuring Brian and Stewie. These were special episodes where Brian and Stewie would end up on some kind of adventure together, usually far from home, trying to find their way back to Quahog. These Road 2 episodes were different from regular Family Guy episodes. They had bigger budgets, more elaborate animation, and longer production times. The writers would craft actual adventure stories with real stakes. Brian and Stewie would face genuine danger, have meaningful conversations, and their relationship would deepen in ways that mattered. The episodes also paid homage to different genres and styles of entertainment. Road to Rhode Island had musical numbers. Road to Germany sent them back to World War II. Road to the Multiverse showed dozens of different animation styles as Brian and Stewie jumped between parallel universes. These episodes demonstrated that Family Guy could be ambitious and creative when the writers put in the effort. What made the Road 2 episodes work was that they balanced comedy with genuine emotion. Yes, there were jokes and absurd situations, but there were also real character moments. Brian and Stewie would have conversations about serious topics like mortality, purpose, and what it means to matter. These talks never felt preachy or heavy-handed. They emerged naturally from the situations the characters found themselves in. The relationship between Brian and Stewie became the emotional heart of the show during this era. Brian, the alcoholic dog who fancied himself an intellectual, and Stewie, the genius baby with unclear motivations, formed an unlikely friendship. Their adventures together gave the show depth that the main family storylines sometimes lacked. Another signature element during this period was Peter's fights with the giant chicken, whose name was Ernie. These fights were elaborate, multi-minute sequences where Peter and this giant chicken would beat each other senseless across various locations. They'd crash through buildings, fall off cliffs, and use whatever objects they could find as weapons. What made these chicken fights special was the effort put into them. The animators would choreograph complex action sequences that parodied famous action movies. A single chicken fight might reference martial arts films, disaster movies, and classic Hollywood chase scenes, all within a few minutes. They were ridiculous, over the top, and completely disconnected from whatever else was happening in the episode. But they were also creative and genuinely entertaining. The chicken fights also had continuity, which was rare for Family Guy. The feud between Peter and Ernie started with a simple dispute over an expired coupon and escalated into an ongoing rivalry that spanned multiple episodes across several seasons. Fans looked forward to seeing when the next chicken fight would happen and how creative it would get. Beyond these signature elements, the show's standard episodes maintained a strong two-plot structure that kept things interesting. A typical episode would have an A-plot and a B-plot running simultaneously. The A-plot usually involved Peter and his three friends getting into some ridiculous situation. The B-plot would focus on other family members or feature a Brian and Stewie adventure. This structure worked because it gave every character something to do. Peter, Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland would be off doing something stupid, while Lois dealt with problems at home, or Brian and Stewie had their own separate adventure. The plots would sometimes intersect, but often they remained completely separate. This meant that if you didn't like one storyline, you at least had another one to enjoy. The characters themselves still had complexity during this golden age. Peter was dumb and made terrible decisions, but he still showed genuine love for his family. There were episodes where Peter went out of his way to help his kids or make Lois happy. Yes, his plans usually backfired and made things worse, but his intentions were good. He was a fool, but he was a well-meaning fool. Brian was pretentious and thought he was smarter than everyone else, but the show would call him out on this. Episodes would humble Brian by showing that his supposed intelligence and culture didn't actually make him a better person. He was flawed and knew it, which made him relatable even when he was being insufferable. Stewie was perhaps the most interesting character during this period because he was actively evolving. In the early seasons, Stewie's whole personality centered on wanting to kill his mother Lois and take over the world. But the writers realized they couldn't keep telling the same jokes about an evil baby forever. During the Golden Age, Stewie's character softened. He became less focused on world domination and more focused on science, time travel, and his friendship with Brian. This evolution happened gradually enough that it felt natural. Stewie didn't suddenly become a completely different character overnight. The changes accumulated over dozens of episodes, until one day fans realized Stewie barely talked about killing Lois anymore. He'd become something more interesting, a genius child, trying to understand a world that didn't take him seriously because he was a baby. Even Meg, who would later become nothing more than a punching bag for the family, had some dignity during this era. The family made fun of her, sure, but it felt like normal sibling teasing and parental exasperation with a difficult teenager. The abuse hadn't yet reached the cruel, constant levels it would hit in later seasons. The cutaway gags during this period were also at their best. Family Guy had always used cutaways, where characters would say something like, "This is worse than the time I," and the show would cut to a completely unrelated scene showing that past experience. These cutaways became a defining feature of the show's style. During the Golden Age, the cutaways were creative and actually funny. They required cultural knowledge to understand, rewarding viewers who got the references. The show would parody specific movies, television shows, historical events, and pop culture moments. The humor came from the cleverness of the reference and the twist Family Guy put on it. The cutaways also weren't overwhelming, yet. An episode might have 5 or 6 cutaways, which was enough to break up the main story without destroying it. The jokes served as seasoning on the main course, rather than becoming the entire meal. You could remove the cutaways and still have a coherent story, which meant the cutaways felt like bonus content rather than filler. The show's willingness to experiment also kept things fresh. Some episodes would try different formats or styles. There were episodes done entirely in musical numbers, episodes that parodied specific movies from beginning to end, and episodes that played with time or perspective in interesting ways. The writers weren't content to just tell the same kinds of stories over and over. They wanted to see what else they could do with the format. Family Guy also succeeded during this era because it had found its identity. The show wasn't trying to be The Simpsons. It wasn't trying to be South Park. It was its own thing, more random than The Simpsons, less political than South Park, cruder than both, but also occasionally more heartfelt than either. The show appealed to a specific audience and didn't apologize for it. If you didn't like crude humor, random cutaways, and pop culture references, Family Guy wasn't for you. But if you did like those things, Family Guy delivered them better than any other show on television. The voice acting remained strong throughout this period. Seth MacFarlane voiced multiple characters, including Peter, Stewie, and Brian, and he brought distinct personalities to each one. Peter sounded like an idiot from Rhode Island. Stewie had his British accent and sophisticated vocabulary. Brian sounded like a failed writer who drank too much. You could close your eyes and immediately know which character was talking. The other voice actors were equally committed. Alex Borstein brought real emotion to Lois, making her more than just the nagging wife. Seth Green gave Chris a specific kind of awkward teenage energy. Mila Kunis, who took over the role of Meg starting in Season 2, made Meg sympathetic even when she was pathetic. The animation quality was also improving. Fox was investing more money into Family Guy now that it was a proven success, and that money showed up on screen. The show looked sharper and more polished than it had during the original run. Action sequences became more elaborate. The different animation styles used in special episodes became more sophisticated. Behind the scenes, the writer's room was functioning at a high level. Television comedy writing is collaborative work. A room full of writers will pitch jokes, debate storylines, and work together to make each script as funny as possible. During this golden age, Family Guy had assembled a talented group of writers who understood what made the show work. The writers also benefited from the 3-year break. They'd come back refreshed rather than burned out. They had new ideas and new energy. The break had given them time to watch other shows, experience new things, and bring fresh perspectives to the work. Seth MacFarlane was still actively involved during this period. He hadn't checked out yet. He was in the writer's room, voicing characters, making decisions about the show's direction. His creative vision still guided Family Guy, which meant the show maintained a consistent voice and point of view. The show's success during this golden age created a positive cycle. Good ratings meant more money from Fox. More money meant better animation, more ambitious episodes, and the ability to attract talented writers and guest stars. Those improvements made the show even better, which attracted more viewers, which brought in more money, and the cycle continued. Family Guy became a cultural force during these years. Quotes from the show entered everyday conversation. The cutaway gag format influenced other comedies. Characters like Stewie became recognizable even to people who'd never watched the show. Fox started merchandising Family Guy heavily, selling t-shirts, DVDs, toys, and video games. By 2009, Family Guy had been on the air in its second run for 4 years. It had produced over 100 new episodes since coming back. It was consistently one of Fox's highest-rated shows. The DVD sales remained strong. Everything seemed perfect. But perfection never lasts in television. The very success that made this golden age possible was about to become the show's greatest liability. The pressure to keep producing episodes, to maintain ratings, to satisfy Fox's financial expectations, would push the writers to make choices that would fundamentally change what Family Guy was. The first cracks were already starting to show by late Season 7 and early Season 8, though most fans didn't notice them yet. The cutaways were getting longer and less connected to the main stories. The characters were becoming slightly more exaggerated versions of themselves. The balance between heart and humor was shifting toward pure comedy. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These changes were subtle at first, small enough that they seemed like natural evolution rather than decline, but they were building towards something much bigger and much worse. Season 8 would mark the point where Family Guy's golden age ended and something else began. Something that would eventually destroy everything fans loved about the show. Section 4, Season 8, The Tipping Point, 2009 to 2010. For 4 years after Family Guy's revival, everything had been going right. The show was funny, creative, and successful. Fans were happy, critics were mostly positive. Fox was making money. But in 2009, during Season 8, something changed. This is the season where, according to fans and critics who've studied the show's history, the rot fully set in. The decline didn't happen overnight. It had actually started earlier, back in Season 4, but most fans didn't notice it at the time. The seeds were planted in an episode called Petarded, where Peter took an intelligence test and was legally declared mentally disabled. This episode was meant as a one-time joke, but it had lasting consequences for how the writers thought about Peter's character. Before Petarded, Peter was stupid, yes, but in a believable way. He was the kind of idiot you might actually know in real life. He didn't understand complicated things. He made bad decisions because he didn't think them through. But he could still function as a normal adult. He held down a job, he drove a car, he had conversations that made sense, even if the conclusions he reached were wrong. After Petarded, the writers started pushing Peter's stupidity further and further. If Peter could be legally mentally disabled, then he could be even dumber than that, right? The character who once had moments of genuine intelligence and insight gradually became someone who couldn't remember basic facts or understand simple concepts. This process happened slowly at first. Season 4 through Season 7 saw Peter get progressively dumber, but it was gradual enough that each individual episode didn't feel that different from the last one. It was like watching someone gain weight. You don't notice it day by day, but when you look at photos from 5 years ago, the difference is obvious. By Season 8, which aired from 2009 to 2010, Peter had crossed a line. He wasn't just dumb anymore. He'd become what fans and critics call a psychopathic man-child. This is an important distinction. A dumb person makes mistakes because they don't know better. A psychopathic man-child makes mistakes because they don't care about hurting other people. Early Peter would accidentally hurt someone and feel bad about it. Season 8 Peter would hurt someone and laugh about it. Early Peter's destructive behavior came from ignorance and arrogance. Season 8 Peter's destructive behavior came from cruelty and selfishness. The character had fundamentally changed, and not for the better. Examples from this era show the difference clearly. In early seasons, when Peter did something that hurt Meg's feelings, the episode would end with Peter realizing his mistake and trying to make it up to her. By Season 8, Peter would actively mock Meg just to be mean. There was no lesson learned, no apology, no growth. Peter had become a bully who happened to be Meg's father. The same shift happened with Peter's intelligence. Early Peter might not understand a complicated political issue, but he could grasp basic cause and effect. Season 8 Peter couldn't understand anything. He became the kind of stupid where you wonder how he manages to dress himself in the morning. The show played this for laughs, but it made Peter impossible to relate to or root for. This transformation had a ripple effect on the entire show. Peter is the main character. Most episodes revolve around him. When the main character becomes unlikable, everything else suffers. It's hard to care about Peter's problems when Peter himself doesn't seem to care about anything except his own immediate gratification. Peter wasn't the only character who changed during this period. Brian, the dog, underwent his own transformation. In the early seasons and Golden Age, Brian was pretentious and self-important, but the show treated this as a flaw. Episodes would humble Brian by showing that his supposed intelligence didn't make him a better person. He was flawed, but he was self-aware about his flaws, which made him sympathetic. By Season 8, Brian's pretentiousness had become his only personality trait. He wasn't just a failed writer who drank too much and had opinions about politics and culture. He became a smug jerk who looked down on everyone around him. The show stopped calling him out on this behavior and instead seemed to endorse it. Brian's relationship with Quagmire, Peter's neighbor and friend, became particularly toxic during this era. In earlier seasons, Quagmire and Brian just didn't get along that well, but it was low-level annoyance rather than genuine hatred. Starting around this time, Quagmire developed an intense, burning hatred for Brian that became a running plot point. In one infamous episode from this era, Quagmire delivers a long speech explaining exactly why he hates Brian, listing all of Brian's personality flaws in detail. The speech was meant to be a moment where Brian gets taken down a peg, but it went too far. It turned Quagmire into someone who seemed obsessed with hating Brian, and it made their every interaction uncomfortable rather than funny. Meg's treatment by the family also reached new lows during this period. In early seasons, Meg was unpopular and awkward, and her family teased her about it. That's normal family behavior. By Season 8 and the seasons immediately after, the entire family actively hated Meg for no reason. They would go out of their way to insult her, exclude her, and make her life miserable. The show tried to justify this in a later episode called Seahorse Seashell Party from Season 10. Which we'll discuss more later, but the basic message was that Meg needed to accept being the family's punching bag because her role as the person everyone hated somehow kept the family together. This was dark and mean-spirited in a way that wasn't funny. Lois, Peter's wife, also became meaner during this period. Early Lois was the responsible parent who kept the family functioning despite Peter's stupidity. She loved Peter despite his flaws. By Season 8, Lois seemed to barely tolerate Peter. She would mock him cruelly, cheat on him emotionally or physically, and generally act like she regretted marrying him. Their marriage, which had been dysfunctional but loving, became dysfunctional and loveless. Even supporting characters weren't safe from these changes. Joe Swanson, The paraplegic police officer who was Peter's friend went from being a capable, confident cop who happened to be in a wheelchair to someone the show used as a punching bag for disability jokes. His character became defined entirely by his wheelchair rather than by his personality. Cleveland, Peter's other friend, became less distinct and interesting. Quagmire became creepier and more aggressive in his pursuit of women, crossing the line from being a womanizer to being genuinely threatening. Every character became a more extreme, less nuanced version of themselves. While all these character changes were happening, the show's signature elements were also declining. The Road to episodes, which had been highlights of the Golden Age, became less frequent and less ambitious. The last true Road to episode aired in 2016 with Road to India, but by then, the format had already lost its magic. These special episodes had worked because they balanced adventure, humor, and genuine emotion. They gave Brian and Stewie real challenges to overcome and used those challenges to deepen their friendship. Later Road 2 episodes kept the adventure and humor but lost the heart. They became just another way to fill time, rather than something special the writers crafted with care. The elaborate chicken fights between Peter and Ernie also became less special. In the Golden Age, these fights happened occasionally and were events that fans looked forward to. The animators would spend weeks choreographing complex action sequences that parodied famous movies and showed genuine creativity. By season 8 and beyond, the chicken fights felt like obligations rather than opportunities. The creativity was gone. The fights followed the same patterns every time. They'd lost the element of surprise and innovation that had made them fun in the first place. What had been special became routine. The cutaway gags, Family Guy's most recognizable feature, also deteriorated during this period. In the Golden Age, cutaways were clever pop culture references that rewarded viewers for getting the joke. They were short, punchy, and actually funny. An episode might have 5 or 6 cutaways, which was enough to add flavor without overwhelming the main story. By season 8, cutaways had become a crutch. Episodes would have 10 or 12 or even more cutaways. Some cutaways would last a minute or longer. The writers started using cutaways as filler to pad out episodes that didn't have enough plot to fill the time. The quality of the cutaways themselves also declined. Instead of clever references that required cultural knowledge, the show started doing lazy, obvious jokes. The format became predictable. A character would say, "This is like the time," and the show would cut to some random scenario that barely related to what they were talking about. Some cutaways became infamous for how much viewers hated them. The Conway Twitty cutaways were the worst offenders. Conway Twitty was a country music singer who died in 1993. For reasons that nobody understood, Family Guy started doing cutaways that were just full, unedited Conway Twitty performances that would last 2 or 3 minutes. These weren't parodies. They weren't jokes. They were literally just footage of Conway Twitty singing a song from beginning to end. The first time the show did this, it was weird enough to be kind of funny in its randomness. By the 10th time, it was just the writers admitting they couldn't write enough jokes to fill an episode, so they were using someone else's music to waste time. The show also started using more live-action footage, which felt lazy and out of place. Family Guy is a cartoon. The whole point is that it's animated. When the show cuts to real footage of real people or real animals, it breaks the reality of the show in a way that isn't clever or funny. It's just the animators admitting they didn't want to draw something, so they're using found footage instead. Beyond the specific problems with characters and cutaways, there was a larger issue emerging. The show was losing its balance. Early Family Guy and Golden Age Family Guy had managed to be crude and offensive while also having heart. Episodes could be shocking and boundary-pushing, while also telling stories with real emotional stakes. By season 8, the balance had tipped entirely toward shock value. Episodes became competitions to see what offensive or disgusting thing the writers could get away with. There was no heart anymore, no emotion, no reason to care about anything that happened. The violence in particular became more graphic and mean-spirited. Early Family Guy had cartoon violence where characters would get hurt in exaggerated, silly ways. By season 8, the violence was more realistic and disturbing. Characters would bleed, suffer visible injuries, and experience pain in ways that weren't funny. The show seemed to delight in making viewers uncomfortable rather than making them laugh. The shift away from actual storytelling was also becoming obvious. Episodes no longer had coherent plots with beginnings, middles, and ends. Instead, they were just collections of random scenes barely held together by the thinnest excuse for a story. You could shuffle the scenes in a different order, and it wouldn't matter, because nothing connected to anything else. Season 10, which aired from 2011 to 2012, is considered by many fans and critics to be the worst season in Family Guy's history, or at least among the worst. If Season 8 was where the rot set in, Season 10 was where it became impossible to ignore. The show was producing episode after episode that fans actively hated. One infamous episode from Season 10, Seahorse Seashell Party, became a symbol of everything wrong with the show. The episode featured Meg finally standing up to her family and calling them out for years of abuse. For a moment, it seemed like the show was going to address its own mean-spirited treatment of Meg. But then the episode revealed that Meg needed to stay quiet and accept the abuse because her role as the family punching bag somehow kept everyone else functioning. The message was dark, cruel, and not funny at all. By the end of Season 8 and the beginning of Season 10, the transformation was complete. Family Guy had gone from the show with heart and creativity to a show that seemed to exist only to shock and offend. The characters fans had once loved were now unrecognizable. The signature elements that had made the show special were gone or corrupted beyond repair. What made this decline particularly tragic was that it wasn't necessary. Nobody forced the writers to make these changes. Fox wasn't demanding that Peter become meaner or that cutaways become longer and lazier. These were creative choices, and they were the wrong choices. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The question fans started asking was why? Why would the writers deliberately make their show worse? Why would they destroy characters people loved? Why would they abandon everything that had made Family Guy successful during its golden age? The answer to these questions lies in a phenomenon that happens to many long-running shows. Something so common it has its own name. Section 5. The Flanderization Epidemic. There's a word for what happened to Family Guy's characters, and that word is Flanderization. The term comes from Ned Flanders, a character on The Simpsons. When The Simpsons first started, Ned Flanders was a friendly, kind neighbor who happened to be religious. He had a personality beyond just being Christian. He had hobbies, relationships, and complexity. But as The Simpsons went on for years and years, the writers started focusing more and more on Ned's religion. Eventually, that became his only trait. He went from being a well-rounded character who was religious to being nothing but a walking Bible quote. Every joke about Ned became a joke about Christianity. Every storyline involving Ned revolved around his faith. The character became flat and one-dimensional. This happens to a lot of long-running shows. Writers take one characteristic that defines a character and keep pushing it further and further until that single trait becomes the character's entire personality. It's easier than writing complex characters with multiple dimensions. It's faster. And when you're producing dozens of episodes per year for many years in a row, easy and fast become very tempting. Family Guy didn't just have one or two characters suffer from Flanderization. Almost every major character became a victim of this process. And according to Wikipedia's article on Flanderization, Family Guy has been called out as one of the most prominent examples in animation, particularly with the characters of Peter and Brian Griffin. Let's start with Peter, since his transformation was the most dramatic and the most damaging to the show. In seasons 1 through 7, Peter Griffin was a bumbling idiot, but he had redeeming qualities. He loved his family deeply. He genuinely cared about his kids, especially Meg. In one early episode, Peter explicitly says he would take a bullet for Meg. Think about that. The same character who would later spend entire episodes mocking and abusing his daughter once said he'd die to protect her. Early Peter made terrible decisions, but those decisions came from a place of good intentions. He'd see a problem and want to fix it. His solution would be stupid and make everything worse, but you understood why he did it. He was trying to help. He was trying to be a good father and husband. He just didn't have the intelligence or wisdom to pull it off. When early Peter hurt people, it was usually by accident. He was what fans call innocently insensitive. He didn't realize his actions would cause harm. When he found out he'd hurt someone, he felt bad. The show would end with Peter learning a lesson and trying to make things right. He grew, even if he made the same types of mistakes again later. Starting around season 8, Peter changed. The word that fans and critics use to describe later Peter is psychopathic man-child. He went from being lovable and dumb to being cruel and dangerous. His intelligence dropped from regular idiot levels to what sources describe as legally mentally disabled. Peter became so stupid that viewers genuinely wondered how he could function in society. But the stupidity was actually less of a problem than the cruelty. Season 8 and beyond, Peter actively enjoyed hurting people. He'd do mean things to his family and friends and laugh about it. When someone got upset, Peter wouldn't care. He showed no remorse, learned no lessons, and felt no guilt. The abuse Peter directed at Meg became particularly horrible. He went from being a protective father who would die for his daughter to someone who seemed to genuinely hate her. Peter would insult Meg constantly, exclude her from family activities, and mock her in front of others. These weren't jokes anymore. They were cruelty disguised as comedy. Peter's relationship with Lois also deteriorated. Early Peter clearly loved his wife and found her attractive. He wanted to make her happy. Later, Peter treated Lois terribly, mocking her, ignoring her, and generally acting like being married to her was a burden. The show played this as normal rather than as a problem that needed fixing. The transformation was so extreme that fan communities created entire wikis dedicated to analyzing it. One wiki describes later Peter as malicious, idiotic, monstrous, and incredibly abusive and insensitive. Another says he became someone who does illegal and evil things in almost every episode and is always excused for his actions because the show claims he does them out of idiocy, even though that's not true. Peter Griffin's Flanderization has been called one of the worst character changes in cartoon history. Some fans say it's one of the worst character changes in all of fiction. That's not an exaggeration from angry viewers. That's the assessment from people who study television and track how shows change over time. Brian Griffin suffered a different, but equally destructive Flanderization. In early seasons, Brian was pretentious and thought he was smarter than everyone else, but he had depth beyond that. He was a failed writer struggling with his own mediocrity. He drank too much and had complicated relationships. He tried to be intellectual and cultured, but often fell short. His pretentiousness was one trait among many. The show also called Brian out on his pretentiousness. Episodes would humble him by showing that his supposed intelligence didn't make him better than anyone else. Brian would do something arrogant, get knocked down, and learn from it. He had self-awareness about his flaws, which made him relatable. Starting around the same time Peter's character deteriorated, Brian became nothing but his worst traits. Sources describe him as becoming a smug snake and a walking political mouthpiece. His entire personality became about being pretentious and looking down on others. Every conversation turned into Brian lecturing people about politics or culture. The show stopped calling Brian out on this behavior. Instead, the show seemed to agree with Brian that he was smarter and better than everyone around him. This made Brian insufferable to watch. Fans who once liked Brian as a flawed but sympathetic character started actively disliking him. Brian's feud with Quagmire, Peter's neighbor, became toxic during this period. In an episode from around this time, Quagmire delivers a long speech listing every reason he hates Brian. The speech tears Brian apart as a person, calling him a pretentious phony who thinks he's special but is actually pathetic. The scene was clearly meant to be a moment where Brian gets taken down and faces consequences for his behavior, but it went too far. Quagmire came across as obsessed and cruel rather than justified, and the feud between them became a recurring element where neither character looked good. Every interaction between Brian and Quagmire was uncomfortable and mean rather than funny. Stewie Griffin had a different kind of Flanderization. His transformation was less about becoming worse and more about becoming boring. Early Stewie was a genius baby bent on killing his mother Lois and taking over the world. This was funny because the contrast between being a baby and being an evil mastermind created interesting situations, but the writers realized they couldn't keep making jokes about a baby trying to murder his mother forever. Eventually, that concept would get old, so they started changing Stewie's character. He became less focused on world domination and more focused on science and inventions. His relationship with Brian became the center of his character. By the later seasons, Stewie had become what sources describe as Brian's effeminate sidekick. He'd completely lost his evil genius personality. The baby who once wanted to destroy the world now just wanted to hang out with the family dog. Stewie became softer, less threatening, and less interesting. The writers admitted this change was intentional. They said they felt they'd run out of jokes about Stewie being evil, but in changing Stewie's character so drastically, they removed what made him special. He became just another character, instead of the unique presence he'd been. Meg Griffin's Flanderization was perhaps the cruelest. In early seasons, Meg was unpopular and awkward. She struggled to fit in at school. Her family teased her the way families tease each other. It was normal family dynamics taken to comedic extremes. As the show went on, the teasing became abuse. The entire family started actively hating Meg for no reason. They would go out of their way to hurt her feelings, exclude her from activities, and make her life miserable. Meg became nothing but a punching bag. Her entire character existed so other characters could be mean to her. In season 10, an episode called Seahorse Seashell Party tried to address this. Meg finally stands up to her family and calls them out for years of abuse. She lists all the terrible things they've done to her and demands they treat her better. For a moment, it seemed like the show was going to fix this problem, but then the episode revealed that Meg had to accept the abuse. According to the episode's logic, Meg's role as the family punching bag somehow kept everyone else functioning. When Meg stopped accepting abuse, the family fell apart, so Meg learned she needed to go back to being the victim to keep the family together. This was dark and mean-spirited. It sent the message that abuse victims should stay quiet for the good of their abusers. Fans hated this episode. Critics hated it. It became a symbol of how cruel and thoughtless Family Guy had become. Lois Griffin became less responsible and more reckless. Early Lois was the level-headed member of the family who kept everything together despite Peter's stupidity. She loved her husband and kids. She made sacrifices to take care of them. Later, Lois became meaner, more selfish, and less patient. She would cheat on Peter, or consider cheating on him. She'd mock him cruelly instead of just being frustrated with him. She participated in abusing Meg. Her character went from being the family's foundation to being just another person making everything worse. Joe Swanson, the police officer in a wheelchair, went from being a capable, confident character to being nothing but disability jokes. Early Joe was good at his job despite his disability. He could do things other people couldn't because he'd adapted and worked hard. His disability was part of his character, but not his defining feature. Later, Joe became a victim of constant jokes about being in a wheelchair. Sources describe how Joe went from being a strong and confident police officer who was a good role model to a crutch for cruel handicap jokes. In one particularly dark episode from the later seasons, Joe tries to kill himself because of his disability. The show played serious issues for cheap laughs, rather than treating them with any respect. Quagmire became creepier and more predatory. Early Quagmire was a womanizer with a 1950s swinger attitude. He loved women and pursued them constantly, but in a cartoonish way that felt like a parody of that personality type. Later, Quagmire crossed lines that weren't funny. His pursuit of women became genuinely threatening rather than comedic. Sources describe his behavior as showing increased creepiness and inappropriate behavior. The show made jokes about sexual assault and predatory behavior that weren't actually jokes. They were just descriptions of terrible things presented as if they should be funny. Cleveland Brown had his own show for a while, The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013. During that show, Cleveland's character changed significantly. He became louder, dumber, and less distinct. Fans describe how Cleveland went from being calm and collected to being essentially the black version of Peter Griffin, only slightly smarter. When Cleveland came back to Family Guy after his show was canceled, he'd lost much of what made him interesting. He was just another member of Peter's friend group without a strong personality of his own. Chris Griffin became meaner and angrier in later seasons. Early Chris was dim-witted, but sweet and kind-hearted. Later, Chris would insult people without provocation and had a nastier edge to his personality. He joined the rest of the family in being cruel to Meg instead of having a normal sibling relationship with her. The pattern repeated across almost every character. Take a single trait, exaggerate it, push it further. Keep going until that trait becomes the character's entire personality. Remove complexity, depth, and anything that makes the character feel like a real person. Turn everyone into walking catchphrases and repeated jokes. This wholesale Flanderization destroyed what made Family Guy work during its golden age. Those earlier seasons succeeded because the characters felt real enough to care about. They were exaggerated and cartoonish, but they had emotions and relationships that mattered. When Peter got into trouble, you wanted to see how he'd get out of it. When Brian faced his failures, you felt for him. When Stewie plotted world domination, it was funny because you could see the baby logic behind it. Once every character became a one-dimensional caricature, there was nothing left to care about. Peter's problems didn't matter because Peter was too stupid and cruel to deserve sympathy. Brian's struggles weren't interesting because he was too smug to be relatable. Stewie's adventures were meaningless because his character had no edge anymore. Meg's suffering wasn't funny because it was just abuse. The Flanderization epidemic didn't just hurt individual characters, it hurt the show's ability to tell stories. Stories need characters that audiences can invest in. When every character is terrible in one-dimensional ways, there's no emotional foundation for storytelling. Everything becomes just jokes and references, with no heart holding them together. Other animated shows have dealt with Flanderization, but Family Guy's case was particularly severe because it happened to every character simultaneously. The Simpsons had characters suffer Flanderization over their long run, but others remained complex. South Park managed to keep its main characters relatively consistent, despite running for decades. Family Guy seemed to actively embrace Flanderization as a creative choice. The writers pushed characters to their extremes deliberately, perhaps thinking it would make them funnier or more memorable. Instead, it made them unbearable to watch and impossible to care about. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. But the destruction of Family Guy's characters through Flanderization was only part of the problem. While the show was busy ruining its own cast, something else was happening that would make the decline even worse. The people who created entertainment that Family Guy's creators respected were watching what was happening to the show, and they weren't staying quiet about it. Section 6. South Park's Devastating Critique, April 2006. In April 2006, South Park, the other major adult animated comedy on television, did something unprecedented. They dedicated 2 full episodes to attacking Family Guy, not just making fun of it, but systematically taking apart everything the show did and explaining exactly why it was lazy and bad. These episodes, called Cartoon Wars Part 1 and Cartoon Wars Part 2, aired on April 5th and April 12th, 2006. At the time, Family Guy was still in its golden age, riding high on the success of its revival. The show was popular, making money, and seemed unstoppable. Then South Park came along and said what a lot of people in the animation industry had been thinking, but were too polite to say out loud. The basic plot of the South Park episodes involved a fake controversy about Family Guy planning to show the Muslim prophet Muhammad in an upcoming episode. But that controversy was just the frame for the real target. South Park wasn't actually interested in debating religious sensitivity. They wanted to explain why Family Guy's writing was fundamentally terrible. In the second part of the 2-episode story, Eric Cartman, one of South Park's main characters, travels to the Family Guy studios in Hollywood. He's trying to get the show canceled. When Cartman meets the Fox executives and asks to speak with the Family Guy writers, they take him to meet the writing staff. This is where South Park delivered its most brutal criticism. The writers of Family Guy, according to South Park, weren't people at all. They were manatees, large sea mammals living in a tank at the studio. The manatees had a huge pile of balls in their tank. Each ball had a word written on it. Some balls had nouns like Gary Coleman or laundry. Other balls had verbs or random references. The manatees would randomly select balls from the pile and push them through a slot. A machine would take whatever balls the manatees selected and automatically generate a Family Guy cutaway gag from those random words. South Park showed an example. The manatees select balls that say laundry, date, winning, Mexico, and Gary Coleman. The machine processes these random words and creates a cutaway where Peter says something like, "This is worse than the time I won a date in Mexico with Gary Coleman," and the show cuts to Peter and Gary Coleman doing laundry on a date in Mexico. The joke was devastating in its simplicity. South Park was saying that Family Guy's cutaway gags weren't actually written by talented comedy writers carefully crafting jokes. They were random combinations of words and pop culture references that had nothing to do with anything. You could generate them by pulling words out of a hat. You didn't need creativity or skill or thought. You just needed random references. South Park's criticism went deeper than just the manatees joke. Throughout the episodes, characters explained exactly what was wrong with Family Guy's approach to comedy. In one scene, Cartman says to Kyle, another South Park character, "I am nothing like Family Guy. When I make jokes, they are inherent to a story. Deep situational and emotional jokes based on what is relevant and has a point, not just one random interchangeable joke after another." This line perfectly captured the difference between South Park and Family Guy. South Park's episodes were about something. They had themes and arguments. The jokes emerged from the characters and situations in the story. You couldn't just cut out a joke and drop it into a different episode, because every joke was connected to that specific story. Family Guy, on the other hand, had cutaway gags that could exist anywhere. They weren't connected to the plot or the characters. Peter could say, "This reminds me of the time," in any episode about anything, and the cutaway would be exactly the same. The jokes were interchangeable because they had nothing to do with the actual story being told. South Park also mocked the fact that Family Guy's cutaways prevented any real emotional development. When something dramatic happens in a Family Guy episode, the show immediately undercuts it with a random cutaway. The audience never gets to sit with the emotion or see the characters deal with the situation in a meaningful way. At one point in the South Park episode, after Cartman has explained his elaborate plan, Kyle has a strong emotional reaction. Cartman responds by saying, "Emotional character development based on what's happening in the storyline. Not at all like Family Guy." The joke being that South Park characters had real feelings that grew out of the plot, while Family Guy constantly avoided those moments by cutting away to random jokes. Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the creators of South Park, weren't subtle about their feelings toward Family Guy. In interviews around this time, they made their position clear. Parker and Stone stated publicly, "We do hate it, we just don't respect it in terms of writing." They also said that being compared to Family Guy was one of the worst things anyone could say to them. In multiple interviews, Parker and Stone mentioned that people would come up and say things like, "You guys have one of the best shows on television, you and Family Guy," and they found that incredibly insulting. They didn't want to be grouped with a show they considered to have lazy writing. What made South Park's attack even more impactful was the response from other people working in animation. After Cartoon Wars aired, writers from The Simpsons and King of the Hill reached out to thank Parker and Stone. According to Parker and Stone, The Simpsons writers sent them flowers. Think about that for a moment. The Simpsons, the most successful and longest-running animated comedy in television history, was so grateful that someone had finally called out Family Guy's terrible writing that they sent flowers to say thank you. The writers from King of the Hill called Parker and Stone to tell them they were doing God's work by attacking Family Guy. These weren't random people. These were professional comedy writers working on successful shows who respected the craft of writing. They'd been watching Family Guy get praised and become successful despite what they saw as lazy, terrible writing. And they were thrilled someone finally said something publicly. In the South Park DVD commentary for these episodes, Trey Parker talked about the response from the animation community. He said, "There was this animation solidarity moment where everyone did come together over their hatred of Family Guy." Parker went on to say that The Simpsons and King of the Hill writers actually hate Family Guy more than we do, even though they won't say it publicly. South Park even included subtle references to The Simpsons and King of the Hill in the second episode as a way of acknowledging their support. Bart Simpson appears briefly in the episode, showing that The Simpsons was on South Park's side in this fight. The criticism from South Park was particularly painful because it was accurate. Anyone who watched Family Guy could see that the cutaway gags often had nothing to do with the plot. The show would be in the middle of a story, a character would make a reference, and suddenly the audience was watching a completely unrelated scene from a different time and place. When the cutaway ended, the show would return to the original story as if nothing had happened. In the early seasons and golden age of Family Guy, this structure worked because the cutaways were clever and the main stories were strong enough to survive the interruptions. But by 2006, when South Park aired these episodes, the balance had shifted. The cutaways were becoming longer, less clever, and more frequent. The main stories were becoming weaker and less important. The show was turning into exactly what South Park accused it of being: random jokes with no connection to anything. Seth MacFarlane, Family Guy's creator, responded to South Park's criticism, but his response was complicated. In a 2006 appearance at Harvard University, McFarlane addressed the South Park episodes in character as Stewie Griffin. He said he thought the South Park criticism was funny and accurate. In later interviews, McFarlane expanded on this. He said he found the manatees joke funny and didn't take offense to it, but he also said he didn't understand the personal venom that Parker and Stone showed in interviews outside of the show itself. McFarlane seemed okay with being made fun of in a South Park episode, but he was confused and hurt by Parker and Stone's harsh statements in real life. The Family Guy writing staff was very aware of how South Park had portrayed them. In DVD commentaries for Family Guy episodes that came out after Cartoon Wars aired, the writers started jokingly referring to their own cutaway gags as manatee jokes. They'd laugh and say things like, "Here comes another manatee joke," when discussing a cutaway in the commentary. This self-awareness shows that the Family Guy writers knew exactly what South Park was accusing them of. They understood the criticism, but instead of taking it seriously and trying to improve, they treated it as a joke. They embraced the manatee comparison rather than working to prove it wrong. Family Guy eventually responded directly to South Park in a 2009 episode called Spies Reminiscent of Us. In this episode, Peter Griffin and his neighbor Glenn Quagmire participate in an improv comedy show. The show is supposed to be improvised, meaning the performers make up jokes on the spot based on suggestions from the audience. During the improv show, Peter keeps doing pre-written cutaway-style gags that have nothing to do with what's happening on stage. These random, disconnected jokes get huge laughs from the audience, while the actual improvised comedy gets nothing. The scene was meant to defend Family Guy's style by showing that audiences love random, non-connected jokes, even if comedy snobs don't approve, but the response fell flat. It came 3 years after South Park's attack, which made it seem like Family Guy had been sitting on this grudge for years. And the argument that audiences like it, so it's good, is weak. Audiences like lots of things that aren't well written. Popularity doesn't equal quality. The bigger problem was that by 2009, when Family Guy aired their response, the show had already started its decline. The cutaway gags had gotten worse, the characters had been Flanderized, and the storytelling had deteriorated. South Park's criticism from 2006 was even more accurate in 2009 than it had been originally. What made South Park's Cartoon Wars episodes so damaging wasn't just that they criticized Family Guy. Lots of people criticized Family Guy. The Parents Television Council had been attacking the show for years, calling it offensive and inappropriate. But nobody took those complaints seriously because they came from conservative groups that didn't like any adult comedy. South Park's criticism was different because it came from fellow creators who understood comedy and animation. Parker and Stone weren't offended by Family Guy being crude or controversial. They were offended by it being lazy. When the most successful adult animated comedy on cable television says your show has terrible writing, and when writers from The Simpsons and King of the Hill agree with them, that means something. The Cartoon Wars episodes also articulated what a lot of viewers felt but couldn't quite put into words. Many people watched Family Guy and enjoyed it, but felt like something was off. The cutaways were funny sometimes, but they disrupted the flow of episodes. The characters were entertaining, but you never really cared about them. The show was enjoyable in the moment, but forgettable afterward. South Park explained why people felt that way. Family Guy's jokes weren't connected to anything meaningful. The comedy was random rather than purposeful. The show prioritized quick laughs over actual storytelling. These weren't personal opinions. They were observations about the show's fundamental structure and approach to comedy. Even more importantly, South Park's criticism was proven right by what happened to Family Guy in the years after 2006. The show didn't improve after being called out. It got worse. The problems South Park identified, the over-reliance on cutaways, the lack of real storytelling, the random interchangeable jokes, all became more extreme as Family Guy continued. By the time season 10 rolled around in 2011, Family Guy had become a parody of itself. The manatees joke wasn't just accurate, it seemed generous. At least manatees randomly selecting balls might occasionally stumble onto a good combination. Later, Family Guy seemed to be deliberately choosing the worst, most offensive, most pointless jokes possible. The reputation damage from South Park's attack was permanent. Before Cartoon Wars, people could argue that Family Guy was misunderstood, or that critics just didn't get it. After Cartoon Wars, that defense became impossible. South Park had laid out a clear, detailed explanation of what was wrong with Family Guy's writing, and the show's continued decline proved them right. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. But South Park's devastating critique, as accurate and damaging as it was, wasn't the worst thing that happened to Family Guy's reputation. The show was about to produce a series of episodes so bad, so offensive, and so poorly conceived that they would become infamous even among people who'd never watched Family Guy regularly. Section 7. The Controversial Episodes Era. Seasons 10 to 14. 2011 to 2014. While Family Guy's characters were being destroyed through Flanderization, and South Park was explaining why the show's writing was terrible, something even worse was happening. The show started producing individual episodes that were so bad, so offensive, and so poorly thought out that they became infamous. These weren't just weak episodes that fans didn't like. These were episodes that made people genuinely angry and disgusted. The period from 2010 to 2014, covering seasons 10 through 14, produced some of the worst episodes in Family Guy's history. Multiple sources identify these seasons, particularly seasons 10, 12, 13, and 14, as the absolute low points of the entire series. But within these terrible seasons, certain episodes stood out as being especially awful. Let's start with Seahorse Seashell Party, which aired on October 2, 2011, as the second episode of season 10. This episode became a symbol of everything wrong with later Family Guy. It's consistently ranked among the worst episodes the show ever produced. The basic plot sounds promising at first. The Griffin family is stuck at home during a hurricane. While they're trapped inside together, Brian eats some magic mushrooms and spends the episode having nightmares and hallucinations. That's the B-plot, and it's just weird, gross-out humor that goes nowhere. The main plot focuses on Meg. After years of being abused, mocked, and treated like garbage by her entire family, Meg finally snaps. She stands up for herself and confronts every member of the family about how terribly they've treated her. Meg calls out Peter for being a terrible father who cares more about his own entertainment than his children. She tells Lois that she's a bad mother who joined in the abuse instead of protecting her daughter. She points out that Chris participates in mocking her instead of being a supportive brother. She lists specific examples of how each family member has hurt her over the years. For viewers who'd been watching Meg get abused for seasons, this felt like the show finally acknowledging the problem. Maybe, people thought, the show would let Meg stand up for herself. Maybe the family would realize they've been terrible and apologize. Maybe things would change. But that's not what happened. Instead, the episode revealed that without Meg as their punching bag, the family falls apart. Peter becomes more violent and destructive. Lois becomes an emotional mess. Chris can't function. According to the episode's logic, Meg being abused was actually good. because it kept the family stable. Her role as the victim everyone could hate brought them together. So Meg learns that she needs to go back to accepting the abuse. She has to let her family treat her terribly, because if she doesn't, they'll hurt each other instead. The episode ends with everything going back to normal, with Meg once again being the family punching bag. The message was horrifying. The show was saying that abuse victims should stay quiet and accept their abuse for the good of their abusers. It was saying that Meg deserved to be treated badly because her suffering served a purpose. This wasn't comedy. This was the show defending its own cruel treatment of a character by claiming that cruelty was necessary. Fans hated this episode. Critics hated it. It appeared on every list of worst Family Guy episodes. The episode became infamous not for being offensive in a boundary-pushing way, but for being offensive in a lazy, thoughtless, genuinely harmful way. What made Seahorse Seashell Party even worse was what aired immediately before it. On October 30th, 2011, just a few weeks later, Family Guy aired another Season 10 episode called Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q. This episode dealt with domestic violence. Quagmire's sister Brenda is in a relationship with an abusive boyfriend named Jeff. Jeff hits Brenda, controls her, and treats her terribly. The episode shows this abuse happening. Quagmire and the other characters try to help Brenda leave Jeff, but she keeps going back to him. Domestic violence is a serious topic that affects millions of people. Shows can address it in meaningful ways that raise awareness and treat victims with respect. But that requires research, care, and sensitivity. Family Guy didn't bother with any of that. Instead, the show made jokes about domestic violence. It played serious moments for laughs. It didn't treat the subject with any of the respect or thoughtfulness it deserved. The episode came across as the writers using a terrible real-world problem as a cheap source of shock value, without actually having anything meaningful to say about it. Screams of Silence aired in the same season as Seahorse Seashell Party, and together they showed how the show had lost any sense of boundaries or taste. These weren't episodes that pushed boundaries in clever ways. They were episodes that took serious topics and handled them in the worst possible manner. But the controversial episodes kept coming. Season 12, which aired from 2013 to 2014, produced multiple episodes that competed for the title of Worst Family Guy Episode Ever Made. Fresh Air aired on March 23, 2014. This episode has been called one of the most uncomfortable, disturbing, and unfunny episodes in Family Guy's history. The plot is simple but horrible. Peter tries to marry his own son Chris to steal an inheritance. Here's what happens. Lois's father, Carter, is rich. Carter decides to leave his entire fortune to his grandson, Chris, instead of to Peter. Peter is angry that he won't get the money. So Peter comes up with a plan. He'll marry Chris. If Chris is Peter's spouse instead of his son, then Peter will get the money when Carter dies. The episode shows Peter courting his own son. It shows them going through a wedding ceremony. It shows Peter and Chris as a married couple. The whole thing is framed as comedy, but there's nothing funny about it. The episode depicts what sources describe as gay pedophilic incest. It's offensive to gay people by suggesting that gay marriage is comparable to a father marrying his son. It's offensive to everyone by making light of incest and child abuse. And it's not even clever or satirical. It's just gross. The episode also includes a scene where Carter, Chris's grandfather, does something inappropriate to Chris. Sources describe it as Carter giving his grandson a hand, meaning inappropriate touching. This scene serves no purpose except to make viewers uncomfortable. Fresh Air currently has a rating of 5.2 out of 10 on IMDb, which is extremely low for a Family Guy episode. Watch Mojo, a popular YouTube channel that makes ranking videos, placed Fresh Air as the second worst Family Guy episode of all time. Phantom Strider, another YouTube creator who analyzes cartoons, ranked it as the fourth worst. Fans describe watching the episode as painful. One common complaint is that the jokes don't land at all. Comedy needs timing and delivery to work. Fresh Air has awkward pauses after jokes where the writers clearly expected laughter, but the jokes are so unfunny that the pauses just highlight how poorly conceived everything is. The episode tries to have heart at the end when Peter apologizes to Chris, but that doesn't excuse or fix the previous 20 minutes of uncomfortable incest jokes. The damage was done. Just a few weeks after Fresh Air aired, Season 12 gave viewers Herpy the Love Sore on April 6, 2014. In this episode, Brian gives Stewie herpes after they become blood brothers by cutting their hands and pressing them together. The whole episode is built around gross-out humor involving a baby with a sexually transmitted disease. There's no clever satire here, no meaningful point being made. It's just, wouldn't it be shocking if a baby had herpes? Stretched out for 20 minutes. Season 12 had already done something similar, with an earlier episode where Stewie becomes pregnant. That episode from season 13 was called Stewie is Enceinte. In it, Stewie somehow becomes pregnant with Brian's baby. The show never bothers explaining how a male baby and a male dog created a pregnancy. The whole concept exists purely for shock value. A writer for Slash Film, a popular entertainment website, reviewed Stewie is Enceinte and wrote, "I don't want to sound like the comedy police, but I think everyone involved in Stewie is Enceinte should go to jail." The review goes on to say that the premise of Stewie being pregnant with Brian's baby shouldn't have even been allowed on Family Guy as a one-off cutaway, let alone as the entire plot of the episode. The review describes the episode as having a repulsive premise that only gets grosser and weirder as it goes on. It says that halfway through watching, you'll start to lose any faith you may have in God, and by the end, you'll fully believe the devil exists, because he surely was involved in this somehow. That's not just one critic being harsh. That's a professional entertainment writer being so disturbed by an episode that they questioned whether the show should be allowed to make content like this. Season 12 also gave us one of Family Guy's most infamous moments, the death and return of Brian Griffin. In the episode Life of Brian, which aired on November 24, 2013, Brian is hit by a car and dies. The family buries him. Stewie is devastated by losing his best friend. The show made a huge deal about Brian's death. Fox promoted it heavily. The media covered it as a major event. Fans were shocked and upset. Brian had been one of the main characters since the first episode. Killing him off seemed like a bold, dramatic choice. Except it wasn't. Just 3 episodes later, on December 15, 2013, in an episode called Christmas Guy, Stewie uses time travel to go back and save Brian. Brian is alive again. Everything goes back to normal. The whole death storyline was erased. The entire thing had been a ratings trick. Fox wanted to get people talking about Family Guy and watching to see what happened. They killed off a beloved character to generate buzz, then brought him back when they'd gotten the attention they wanted. Fans felt manipulated and betrayed. The show had made them genuinely sad about Brian's death, then revealed that none of it mattered. It was all just a stunt to boost ratings. Any remaining trust viewers had that Family Guy might do something meaningful or permanent was destroyed. The death and resurrection of Brian also proved what South Park had been saying years earlier. Nothing in Family Guy mattered. The show could kill off a main character and bring him back 3 episodes later with no consequences. Why should viewers care about anything that happened if the show itself didn't care? These controversial episodes shared common problems. They took serious topics like abuse, domestic violence, or death and treated them carelessly. They went for shock value without having anything meaningful to say. They made viewers uncomfortable in ways that weren't funny or clever, and they showed that the writers either didn't understand or didn't care about the impact their choices had. The episodes also revealed how disconnected the show had become from any sense of boundaries or taste. Early Family Guy pushed boundaries, but there was usually a point to it. The show was trying to prove that adult animation could tackle subjects that other shows wouldn't touch. These later episodes pushed boundaries just to push them. There was no larger purpose, no satirical point, no clever commentary. The writers seemed to think that being shocking was the same as being funny, that making people uncomfortable was the same as making them laugh. What's particularly sad is that these episodes came from the same show that had once told genuinely touching stories about Brian dealing with his abandonment issues or Peter learning to appreciate his family. The writers who created those earlier episodes clearly understood how to balance crude humor with emotional depth. But by seasons 10 through 14, that balance was completely gone. The show had become mean-spirited, lazy, and genuinely unpleasant to watch. These weren't just bad episodes. They were episodes that made people question why they'd ever liked Family Guy in the first place. The controversial episodes era damaged Family Guy's reputation in ways the show never recovered from. People who defended the show for years couldn't defend episodes like Fresh Air or Seahorse Seashell Party. The episodes were indefensible. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. But even as Family Guy was producing these terrible episodes and alienating its own fan base, the show kept going. Fox kept ordering new seasons, the episodes kept coming, and fans started asking an obvious question. Where was Seth MacFarlane in all of this? Why was the show's creator letting this happen to his own creation? Section 8. Seth MacFarlane's departure. As Family Guy spiraled downward through character destruction, terrible episodes, and creative bankruptcy, fans kept asking the same question. Where was Seth MacFarlane? How could the creator of the show just stand by and watch his own creation turn into something so terrible? The answer is simple and sad. Seth MacFarlane checked out years ago. He stopped actively working on Family Guy more than a decade ago, but he kept his name attached to the show and kept voicing characters while other people made the creative decisions. In 2024, during an interview celebrating Family Guy's 25th anniversary, McFarlane was asked about his connection to the show. His answer was revealing. McFarlane said, "For somebody who hasn't worked directly on the show in 15 years, absolutely he feels connected." Think about what that means. In 2024, McFarlane admitted he hadn't worked directly on Family Guy since around 2009. That's season 8, the exact season when fans and critics say the show's quality collapsed. The tipping point where everything went wrong coincided exactly with McFarlane stepping back from day-to-day involvement. The interview got even more telling. The person interviewing McFarlane referenced a specific Family Guy episode. McFarlane's response was to ask, "Has that aired?" The interviewer confirmed yes. It had aired 6 years earlier. McFarlane had no memory of an episode from his own show that had been on television for 6 years. His showrunners, the people who actually run Family Guy on a daily basis, were sitting right there during this conversation. They had to tell their supposed boss about episodes from his own show that he didn't know existed. This wasn't McFarlane being forgetful about minor details. He genuinely didn't know what was happening with Family Guy anymore. This disconnect becomes even clearer when you look at what Mila Kunis, the actress who voices Meg, said about her process. Kunis admitted that she reads the scripts for Family Guy episodes for the first time when she shows up to record her lines. She doesn't prepare ahead of time or study the material. She just reads it cold in the recording booth. McFarlane's response to learning this? By the way, that does make 2 of us. The creator and star of the show, the man who voices Peter, Stewie, Brian, and Quagmire, treats Family Guy scripts the same way as an actress who plays a supporting character. He doesn't read them until he absolutely has to. This level of detachment didn't happen suddenly. McFarlane's relationship with Family Guy had been complicated for years. When the show was canceled in 2002, McFarlane thought that was it. He'd moved on mentally and emotionally. Then, Fox brought the show back in 2005, and McFarlane was excited to have another chance. But even then, McFarlane wasn't planning for Family Guy to run forever. In a 2013 interview with The Hollywood Reporter, when McFarlane was 37 years old, he said something surprising. "I prayed to God every night that it would be 10 years and out." 10 years would have meant ending Family Guy around 2009, right at season 8. That's exactly when McFarlane stopped working directly on the show. It seems like McFarlane wanted Family Guy to end, but Fox didn't let it happen. So instead of ending, the show just kept going without its creators' active involvement. In that same 2013 interview, McFarlane said, "I talked to the fans, and in a way, I'm kind of secretly hoping for them to say, 'We're done with it.'" He was literally hoping that fans would give him permission to stop. He wanted people to tell him the show had run its course, so he could walk away without feeling guilty. McFarlane also said in 2013, "There was a time when I thought, it's time to wrap it up." He believed Family Guy should end, but at the same time, he acknowledged that the vast majority go pale in the face when I mention the possibility of ending the show. Fans didn't want it to end, and Fox certainly didn't want it to end as long as it made money. So McFarlane found himself trapped. He'd created this hugely successful show that he wanted to finish, but everyone else wanted it to continue. His solution was to step back, let other people run the show, continue voicing the characters because his contract required it and because it paid well, but otherwise disconnect from the creative process. The relationship between McFarlane and Fox had been strained for years. During the 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild strike, when writers in Hollywood stopped working to demand better pay and treatment, McFarlane strongly supported the strike. He was out on picket lines with other writers, fighting for their rights. But Fox did something that made McFarlane furious. According to sources, Fox aired 3 Family Guy episodes behind McFarlane's back during the strike. The network went ahead and broadcast episodes that McFarlane and the writers hadn't approved for air. This was Fox's way of showing they were in control, not the creators. McFarlane never forgot that. It showed him that Fox saw Family Guy as their property to do with as they pleased, regardless of what the show's creator wanted. This likely contributed to McFarlane's decision to step back from active involvement. If Fox was going to do what they wanted anyway, why should McFarlane pour his heart into the show? In 2020, McFarlane made his priorities even clearer by signing a $200 million deal with NBC Universal. This was a massive contract to create new content for a completely different company. McFarlane was essentially telling the world that his future was with NBC, not Fox. Family Guy would continue because he was contractually obligated to voice the characters, but his creative energy was going elsewhere. Then, in 2023, during another Writers Guild strike, McFarlane walked off both Family Guy and American Dad. He told the production company that he and the showrunners wouldn't work on either show until the strike ended. McFarlane was willing to shut down production on his own shows to support writers' rights. This seems noble, and it is, but it also shows where McFarlane's loyalty lies. He cares about writers in general having good working conditions. He doesn't specifically care about Family Guy continuing to produce episodes. If anything, the strike gave him an excuse to step away from a show he'd wanted to end for years. Despite all of this detachment and disinterest, McFarlane has never actually quit Family Guy. He's never demanded that Fox end the show. In fact, in recent interviews, he's said the opposite. That same 2024 interview where McFarlane admitted he hasn't worked on the show in 15 years also included him saying, "At this point, I don't see a good reason to stop. People still love it. It makes people happy, and it funds some good causes. The part about funding good causes is important." McFarlane explained, "It's a lot of extraneous cash that you can donate to Rainforest Trust, and you can still go out to dinner that night. In other words, Family Guy makes so much money that McFarlane can donate large amounts to charity and still have plenty left over for himself." McFarlane continued, "There was a time when I thought, it's time to wrap it up. At this point, we've reached escape velocity. I don't know that there's any reason to stop at this point, unless people get sick of it. Unless the numbers show that people just are, we don't care about Family Guy anymore. But that hasn't happened yet." This is brutally honest. McFarlane isn't saying Family Guy should continue because it's still creatively fulfilling, or because he has stories he wants to tell. He's saying it should continue because it makes money and people still watch it. Quality doesn't matter. Creative vision doesn't matter. All that matters is whether the show remains profitable. The co-showrunner of Family Guy, Alex Sulkin, joked in that same interview that the only real concern about the show's future is McFarlane's voice. Sulkin said, "It's this guy's vocal cords. That's what we're all concerned about." At 50 years old, McFarlane acknowledged that recording long hours in a booth is different than it was when he was 24. Voicing multiple characters for multiple episodes takes a physical toll, but as long as McFarlane can still do the voices, the show can continue. And as long as the show continues, McFarlane gets paid. This arrangement is comfortable for everyone, except the fans who remember what Family Guy used to be. Fox gets to keep making money from a proven product. McFarlane gets paid millions of dollars for a few hours of voice work per episode without having to actually run the show. The showrunners get steady employment working on a successful series. The only people who lose are the viewers who wanted Family Guy to maintain the quality of its earlier seasons, or at least to end with dignity before it became unwatchable. There's something particularly sad about a creator abandoning his own creation while continuing to profit from it. McFarlane built Family Guy. He fought to get it made, survived 2 cancellations, and saw it become one of the most successful animated comedies in television history. And then he just walked away from it creatively, while keeping his name on it and cashing the checks. Some people might argue that McFarlane delegating the show to capable showrunners is smart business. He can focus on other projects while Family Guy runs on autopilot. But the problem is that the show didn't run well on autopilot. The people running Family Guy in McFarlane's absence made terrible creative decisions that destroyed the show's quality and reputation. If McFarlane truly cared about Family Guy as a creative work, rather than just as a source of income, he would have either stayed involved to maintain quality or insisted that Fox end the show before it declined too far. Instead, he chose a middle path. Stay detached, but keep collecting money while the show falls apart. McFarlane has other successful projects to his credit. He created American Dad, which many people consider superior to later Family Guy. He created The Cleveland Show, though that show was canceled after a few seasons. He made movies like Ted that were commercially successful. He even created The Orville, a science fiction show that ran for several seasons. These other projects show that McFarlane is still capable of creating good content when he's actually involved and interested. The problem isn't that McFarlane lost his talent. The problem is that he lost interest in Family Guy, but didn't have the courage or contractual freedom to end it. So Family Guy continues year after year with a creator who hasn't worked on it directly in over a decade, who doesn't remember episodes from 6 years ago, and who reads scripts for the first time when he shows up to record his lines. The show has become a job for McFarlane rather than a passion project, and that shows in every episode. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. But McFarlane's abandonment of Family Guy was only part of the show's problems. While the creator checked out and the quality collapsed, something else was happening that made the decline even more obvious and painful. Another Seth MacFarlane show was demonstrating exactly how good adult animation could be when the creator actually cared about it. Section 9. American Dad's Ascension. While Family Guy was busy destroying itself through character flanderization and terrible episodes, something interesting happened. Seth MacFarlane's other show, American Dad, quietly became better than Family Guy in almost every way. This wasn't just one person's opinion. It became what sources call an open secret among McFarlane fans that American Dad has eclipsed its predecessor in quality and comedy. American Dad premiered in 2005, the same year Family Guy came back from cancellation. The show follows the Smith family: Stan, a CIA agent who's extremely conservative and patriotic; Francine, his wife; Haley, their liberal activist daughter; Steve, their nerdy son; Roger, an alien who lives in their attic; and Klaus, a German man whose brain was put into a goldfish's body. On the surface, American Dad looked like Family Guy with different characters. Both shows were created by Seth MacFarlane. Both featured families with weird dynamics. Both had a talking, non-human character living with the family. Both aired on Fox as part of the Sunday night animation block. It made sense for people to see them as basically the same show, but American Dad evolved into something completely different from Family Guy, and in doing so, it demonstrated everything Family Guy was doing wrong. The most obvious difference is in the audience scores. On Rotten Tomatoes, a website that collects reviews from critics and regular viewers, American Dad has a 91% audience score. That means 91% of people who rated the show liked it. Family Guy, by comparison, has a 62% audience score. That's a huge gap. Think about what that means. Both shows are created by the same person. Both air on the same network. Both target the same general audience of adults who like animated comedy, but one show has a 91% approval rating, while the other has 62%. That's not a small difference. That's one show being significantly better than the other in the eyes of actual viewers. The ratings tell a similar story. When American Dad was still on Fox, before it moved to the cable channel TBS, it actually had slightly higher average viewership than Family Guy. The difference was only 0.1 points, which is tiny, but it's still notable. American Dad, the younger show that was supposed to ride Family Guy's coattails, was pulling in just as many viewers as the established hit. So what made American Dad better? The answer comes down to almost every aspect of how the shows approach storytelling and comedy. First, the characters in American Dad actually developed over time. Stan Smith, the father, starts the show as an extreme stereotype of a conservative Republican. He's obsessed with America, supports the CIA without question, and sees liberals as enemies. But over the course of the show, Stan grows. He learns things. His relationship with his liberal daughter Haley becomes more complex. He makes mistakes and actually faces consequences for them. Compare that to Peter Griffin, who never learns anything and never changes. Peter in season 20 is exactly the same as Peter in season 8, except meaner and dumber. There's no growth, no development, no reason to keep watching to see what happens to the character. Every character in American Dad has depth. Francine isn't just a housewife. She has her own storylines, her own desires, her own personality beyond being Stan's wife. Haley and Steve have their own lives and adventures. Roger, the alien, is arguably the most complex character on the show, with dozens of different personalities and disguises that he uses to create chaos. Family Guy, meanwhile, has Flanderized every character into one-dimensional cartoons. Peter is stupid and mean. Brian is pretentious. Stewie is Brian's sidekick. Meg is abused. Lois is frustrated. That's it. That's all they are. The character relationships in American Dad are also far superior. Multiple sources point out that American Dad has numerous interesting character pairings. Steve and Roger have adventures together. Francine and Roger are best friends who get into trouble. Stan and Haley have a complex father-daughter relationship, built on their opposing political views. Stan and Francine actually act like a married couple who loves each other. Family Guy only has one really strong character pairing, Brian and Stewie. Every other relationship on the show is either shallow or toxic. Peter and Lois barely seem to like each other. The family actively hates Meg. Chris doesn't have meaningful relationships with anyone. The characters exist in the same house, but don't have the kind of dynamic, interesting connections that make you want to watch them interact. This matters because television shows, especially sitcoms, live or die based on character relationships. People tune in to see characters they like spending time together. If the characters don't have interesting relationships, there's no reason to care about what happens to them. American Dad also maintains actual storylines with beginnings, middles, and ends. Each episode has a plot that makes sense. Characters face problems, try to solve them, and deal with the consequences of their choices. The show uses what sources call compelling B-plots, meaning the secondary storylines are just as interesting as the main ones. Family Guy abandoned coherent plotting years ago. Episodes are just collections of random scenes held together by the thinnest excuse for a story. The B-plots disappeared entirely. Everything became about cramming in as many cutaway gags as possible, regardless of whether they served any purpose. The humor itself differs in important ways. American Dad creates what multiple sources describe as jokes with tact and elegance. The show goes for clever humor that requires thought rather than obvious, crude jokes. When American Dad makes a reference, it's because the reference enhances the joke, not because the writers needed to fill time. Family Guy, especially in later seasons, goes for the easiest, crudest joke available. The show relies on shock value and gross-out humor instead of actual wit. As one source puts it, while Family Guy tends to go for the obvious joke, and often the crudest one, American Dad is much the opposite. American Dad also experiments with different formats and styles. The show has done episodes as musicals, episodes in different animation styles, episodes that parody specific genres of entertainment. There's an episode called Rabbit Ears that's done in black and white as a tribute to old television. There's Lost in Space, which sends the characters on a legitimate science fiction adventure. The show takes risks and tries new things. Family Guy used to experiment during its golden age, but that stopped years ago. Now every episode follows the same tired formula. There's no creativity, no ambition, no willingness to try something different. The show became safe and predictable, which is death for comedy. One of the most important differences is how the two shows treat their female characters and minorities. Multiple sources emphasize that American Dad treats these characters with respect, while Family Guy does the opposite. In American Dad, Francine and Haley are actual characters with personalities, goals, and storylines. They're not just there to be mocked or abused. The other characters in the show genuinely like them. When jokes are made about them, they're not mean-spirited or degrading. Family Guy treats Lois and Meg terribly. Lois is either a nagging wife or a target for jokes about women. Meg exists only to be abused by everyone around. The show treats female characters as punching bags rather than as people. The same pattern holds for minority characters. American Dad has gay characters, trans characters, disabled characters, and characters of color who are treated as real people. The show makes jokes involving these characters, but the jokes are respectful and come from a place of understanding rather than mockery. Family Guy makes jokes at the expense of minorities. The humor punches down, meaning it targets people who are already marginalized or struggling. This isn't edgy or brave. It's just mean. Sources point out that a generation of men started speaking to women like characters on Family Guy speak to Meg, as if it was okay and funny, when it was only ever the opposite. Family Guy's treatment of women became so normalized that real people started imitating it, thinking it was acceptable behavior. That's genuinely harmful in a way that goes beyond just making a bad television show. Roger, the alien on American Dad, deserves special mention because he exemplifies everything the show does well. Roger has dozens of different personalities and disguises. He becomes different characters, each with their own names, backstories, and motivations. These aren't just quick jokes. Roger's personas are developed enough that they feel like real characters. Sources describe Roger as, by default, extremely dynamic, and say, his characters remain inventive and engrossing, each with a detailed life of their own. One source argues that one could make the argument that Roger's characters alone make American Dad better than Family Guy. Family Guy has nothing comparable. No character on Family Guy offers the variety, creativity, and entertainment value that Roger provides. Brian is supposed to be the show's intellectual character, but he's been Flanderized into a one-note, pretentious jerk. Even at his best, Brian never had the range that Roger demonstrates in every episode. American Dad also does something that Family Guy completely abandoned. The show has morals and lessons. Each episode isn't just about getting laughs. There's usually a point, a message about relationships or society or human nature. The lessons aren't preachy or heavy-handed. They emerge naturally from the story. As one source explains, having a lesson to learn isn't a deal breaker. Plenty of shows don't have that much structure and are still great. When it comes to comparing these two shows, that structure gives American Dad an edge. Family Guy has no lessons. Nothing matters. Characters don't learn or grow. There's no point to anything that happens. The show exists purely to fill time between commercials with random jokes and offensive humor. The care put into American Dad shows in the details. The show maintains continuity, meaning things that happen in one episode affect future episodes. Running jokes and callbacks are used intelligently rather than being beaten to death. The show respects its audience's intelligence instead of treating them like they'll laugh at anything. Even the way American Dad uses its non-human characters shows more thought than Family Guy. Klaus, the German man in a goldfish body, and Roger both function as actual pets in some ways while also being full characters. They have limitations based on what they are. Klaus is often ignored because he's a fish in a bowl. Roger has to hide in the attic because he's an alien. Brian, the dog on Family Guy, doesn't function like a pet at all. He drives cars, dates human women, and has a job as a writer. The show can't decide whether Brian is a dog or a person, so he's inconsistently both. This creates confusion and breaks the show's internal logic. What makes American Dad's superiority particularly interesting is that Seth MacFarlane is involved with both shows. He created both. He voices characters on both. Yet one show maintained quality, while the other fell apart. The difference is that MacFarlane stayed more involved with American Dad. He cared more about it. When MacFarlane checked out of Family Guy around season 8, he didn't check out of American Dad. The show he actually paid attention to became the better show. American Dad also benefits from having showrunners who care about the product. While Family Guy's showrunners seemed content to coast on the show's established success, American Dad's showrunners pushed the show to be better and more creative. The network situation helped too. American Dad eventually moved from Fox to TBS, a cable channel. This move gave the show more creative freedom. Cable channels have different rules than broadcast networks about what content is allowed. American Dad used this freedom to experiment more, rather than just to be more offensive. It's telling that almost every comparison between the two shows favors American Dad. Character development? American Dad wins. Storytelling? American Dad wins. Treatment of women and minorities? American Dad wins. Creativity and experimentation? American Dad wins. The only category where Family Guy beats American Dad is in raw popularity and cultural impact. And that's only because Family Guy came first and had years to build an audience. The existence of American Dad makes Family Guy's decline even more frustrating. The same creator, working in the same medium, with similar resources, proved that he could make a smart, funny, creative animated comedy that maintained quality over many seasons. American Dad showed what Seth MacFarlane was capable of when he actually tried. This made Family Guy's failures inexcusable. The show didn't fall apart because animated comedy is inherently limited, or because it's impossible to keep a show funny for many years. American Dad proved those things weren't true. Family Guy fell apart because the people running it stopped caring about quality and started caring only about profit. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. But even as American Dad demonstrated what good adult animation looked like, Family Guy kept chugging along, getting worse and worse. And the numbers were starting to tell a damning story about just how badly Family Guy had fallen. Section 10. The ratings collapse. While everything else was falling apart, the viewing numbers for Family Guy told their own brutal story. The show that had averaged 7.9 million viewers during its golden age was hemorrhaging its audience. People were abandoning the show in massive numbers, and the ratings data shows exactly when and how badly it happened. To understand the collapse, we need to start at the peak. When Family Guy returned from cancellation in 2005, the show was a phenomenon. The season 4 premiere pulled in 11.85 million viewers. That's huge for an animated comedy on Sunday nights. Throughout seasons 4 through 7, Family Guy averaged around 7.9 million viewers per episode. Fox was thrilled with these numbers. The show was consistently winning its time slot, meaning more people watched Family Guy than any other program airing at the same time on different channels. The network promoted the show heavily and gave it the best possible position in their schedule, right after The Simpsons. But then, something changed. Starting around season 8, which aired from 2009 to 2010, the viewership started declining. It wasn't a sudden drop. It was a slow leak that got worse every year. Season after season, fewer people tuned in to watch new episodes. By season 13, which aired from 2014 to 2015, Family Guy was averaging only 5.86 million viewers per episode. That's a drop of more than 2 million viewers from the golden age. For context, losing 2 million viewers is like losing the entire population of a major city. That's how many people stopped watching Family Guy between its peak and season 13. But it got worse. Season 14, which began airing in September 2015, saw the bottom fall out completely. The season premiere only brought in 2.87 million viewers. That's less than half of what the show had been averaging just a few years earlier, less than a quarter of what the revival premiere had pulled in a decade before. Individual episodes hit even lower numbers. In November 2015, an episode called Peter, Chris, and Brian brought in just 2.58 million viewers. That episode also scored only a 1.1 rating in the key demographic of viewers aged 18 to 49, which is what advertisers care most about. For a show that had once been a ratings powerhouse, these numbers were catastrophic. Even the Halloween episode from season 14, which should have been a special event that drew extra viewers, only managed 3.8 million people. Halloween episodes typically get higher ratings because they're marketed as special. This one still couldn't break 4 million viewers. To put these numbers in context, The Simpsons, which everyone agreed was way past its prime by 2015, was still pulling in around 1 million more viewers than Family Guy. The Simpsons had been on the air since 1989 and was widely considered to be a shadow of its former self. Yet, it was beating Family Guy in the ratings. The only show on Fox's Sunday night lineup that had lower ratings than Family Guy was The Last Man on Earth, a live-action comedy that was struggling to find an audience and would soon be canceled. Family Guy had gone from being the anchor of Fox's animation block to being barely above the worst performer on the schedule. The decline wasn't just about total viewers. The quality of the viewership changed too. When a show is genuinely popular, people watch it live when it airs. They make time for it in their schedules. They gather with friends to watch together. They talk about it online the next day. By the mid-2000s, people weren't doing that with Family Guy anymore. Fans who still watched the show described their viewing habits in telling ways. One person on a fan forum wrote, "Family Guy these days is just something I watch out of boredom. Most newer episodes I only see once and that's it." Another fan said, "When you really think about it, since most of the general public watches new episodes only once or twice, and considering how many episodes are in the Family Guy library, most of the new episodes, in terms of viewership, will probably never have a shelf life beyond maybe 2 airings anyway." Think about what that means. People were watching new Family Guy episodes once, finding them forgettable, and never watching them again. The episodes weren't good enough to rewatch. They weren't memorable enough to recommend to friends. They were just content that people consumed when they had nothing better to do. This is completely different from how people watched Family Guy during the Golden Age. Those episodes became quotable. People rewatched them. The DVD sales that brought the show back from cancellation proved that people wanted to own and rewatch those early episodes. By the 2010s, nobody wanted to rewatch the new stuff. Fans started comparing Family Guy to The Simpsons in a way that wasn't flattering. One fan quoted a line from a deleted Family Guy song that said, "The guy who watched The Simpsons back in 1994 and won't admit the thing isn't funny anymore." The fan then pointed out that over a decade after that song was written, Family Guy had suffered the same fate. Another fan wrote, "I'd say it's hitting the Simpsons era, where people are surprised that they're still making new episodes and that it's still good because they stopped watching years ago." This comparison was particularly cutting because Family Guy had spent years mocking The Simpsons for declining in quality and overstaying its welcome. Now, Family Guy was doing exactly the same thing. The ratings collapse wasn't just about the show getting older. Long-running shows do naturally lose viewers over time as the audience moves on to newer programs. But Family Guy's decline was steeper and faster than normal aging would explain. The timing of the collapse aligns perfectly with all the other problems we've discussed. Season 8, when McFarlane stepped back and the characters started getting Flanderized, is when the ratings began their steady decline. The controversial episodes in seasons 10 through 14 coincided with the ratings hitting new lows. People weren't leaving because they outgrew the show or got bored with the concept. They were leaving because the show had become unwatchable. The characters they'd once liked were now terrible. The storytelling had disappeared. The humor had turned mean and lazy. Why would anyone keep watching? One specific event illustrated how damaged the show's relationship with its audience had become: the death and resurrection of Brian Griffin. In November 2013, Family Guy killed off Brian in an episode called Life of Brian. Fox promoted this heavily as a major event. The media covered it extensively. Social media exploded with reactions. The attention worked. More people tuned in to see what would happen next. Ratings went up temporarily as viewers who'd stopped watching came back to see how the show would handle Brian's death. But then, in December 2013, just 3 episodes later, Family Guy brought Brian back to life through time travel. The whole death had been a stunt to boost ratings. Once viewers realized they'd been manipulated, many of them left for good. Sources specifically cite the death and return of Brian's stunt as something that really hurt the show. The temporary ratings boost wasn't worth the long-term damage to viewer trust. People felt cheated. They felt like the show had exploited their emotional investment just to get better numbers for a few weeks. After the Brian stunt, the ratings decline accelerated. It was as if viewers collectively decided they were done being treated like fools. If nothing that happened in the show mattered, if the writers would undo anything for convenience, why bother watching at all? The show's approach to episodic storytelling made the ratings problem worse. When a show has ongoing storylines and character development, viewers need to keep watching to see what happens next. They're invested in the journey. Missing an episode means missing part of the story. Family Guy abandoned that model completely. Nothing that happened in one episode affected any other episode. Characters never changed or grew. There were no ongoing plots to follow. This meant there was no reason to watch every week. You could skip months of episodes and not miss anything important. This approach might seem like it would help casual viewers who could drop in anytime without being lost, but it actually hurt the show's ratings because it eliminated any sense of urgency about watching. If you could watch episodes in any order and it didn't matter, why bother watching when they first aired? Why watch at all? The ratings data also revealed something interesting about who was still watching. The show's demographic numbers, which measure how many people in specific age groups are watching, showed that Family Guy was losing its younger viewers faster than its older ones. Young adults aged 18 to 34, the group that had made Family Guy a hit during its revival, were abandoning the show. These were people who discovered Family Guy in college during the mid-2000s and had grown up with it. By the 2000s, they were moving on. They'd outgrown the humor, or the humor had changed into something they didn't enjoy anymore. The viewers who stuck around tended to be older and watching more out of habit than genuine enthusiasm. These were people who'd been watching for years and couldn't quite bring themselves to stop, even though they didn't particularly enjoy the new episodes. Fox's response to the declining ratings was to keep ordering new seasons. In January 2015, while the ratings were in free fall, Fox renewed Family Guy for both Season 22 and Season 23. The network was committing to years more of the show, despite clear evidence that viewership was collapsing. Why would Fox do this? Because Family Guy was still profitable. Even with reduced viewership, the show made money through advertising, syndication deals, and merchandise sales. As long as it stayed profitable, Fox would keep producing it, regardless of quality or artistic merit. This created a vicious cycle. The ratings declined because the quality was bad. But Fox wouldn't cancel the show because it was still profitable. Since the show wasn't at risk of cancellation, there was no pressure to improve quality. So the quality stayed bad, which made more viewers leave, which lowered the ratings further. The show that had once defined Sunday night television, that had survived 2 cancellations and come back stronger than ever, was now limping along as a shell of its former self. The viewing numbers told the story of slow death, of an audience that had loved something and watched it turn into something they could barely recognize. Fans who'd grown up with Family Guy, who'd bought the DVDs that saved the show from cancellation, who'd defended it against critics and conservative groups, were walking away. They weren't being replaced by new viewers. The show was dying, but Fox wouldn't let it actually die. The ratings collapse proved that fans could tell the difference between good Family Guy and bad Family Guy. They'd shown up in huge numbers for the Golden Age episodes. They'd abandoned the show when it turned terrible. The audience wasn't wrong or ungrateful. They just wanted the show to be good again. And when it became clear that wouldn't happen, they stopped watching. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. But even as millions of viewers abandoned Family Guy, the show kept producing new episodes with the same terrible formula. And the reason that formula never changed reveals the final piece of the puzzle explaining how Family Guy died while somehow still remaining on the air. Section 11. The Status Quo Prison. One of the most destructive choices Family Guy made was to trap itself in what fans call the status quo prison. Status quo means things stay the same. In the case of Family Guy, it meant that no matter what happened in an episode, everything would reset to normal by the end. Nothing could change, nothing could matter, nothing could have lasting consequences. This wasn't always how Family Guy worked. In the early seasons, characters grew and changed, relationships evolved. Things that happened in one episode could affect future episodes. The show had what's called continuity, meaning the story continued and built on itself over time. But starting around the late 2000s and into the 2010s, Family Guy abandoned continuity almost entirely. The show adopted a reset button approach, where every episode ended exactly where it started. Characters learned lessons and then immediately forgot them. Dramatic events happened and were never mentioned again. Death itself became meaningless. The clearest example of this problem is what happened with Meg in the Season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party that we discussed earlier. Meg finally stood up to her family after years of abuse. She called them out. She demanded better treatment. The episode showed how the family fell apart without Meg as their punching bag. This should have been a turning point for Meg's character. After standing up for herself, she should have been treated differently going forward. The family should have learned to respect her, or at least the show should have acknowledged that something had changed in their relationships. Instead, The episode ended with everything going back to normal. Meg accepted that she needed to stay quiet and be abused for the family to function. By the next episode, it was as if nothing had happened. The family went right back to treating Meg terribly. Her big moment of growth and courage meant absolutely nothing. This pattern repeated constantly. Characters would have meaningful experiences that should change them, but by the next episode, they'd forgotten all about it. Peter would learn to appreciate his family, then immediately go back to being selfish and cruel. Brian would realize he was pretentious and needed to change, then continue being pretentious. Stewie would show genuine emotion and vulnerability, then return to being cold and sarcastic. The death and resurrection of Brian Griffin stands as the perfect example of the status quo prison, destroying any sense of stakes or meaning. In November 2013, Brian was hit by a car and died. The show dedicated significant time to showing the family grieving. Stewie was devastated. The funeral was emotional. Brian was gone. For 3 episodes, the show existed without Brian. Fans were genuinely upset. Many people who'd stopped watching Family Guy tuned back in to see how the show would function without one of its main characters since the very first episode. Brian's death seemed like a bold, permanent change that would force the show to evolve. Then, in December 2013, just 3 episodes later, Stewie used time travel to go back and prevent Brian's death. Brian was alive again. Everything returned to exactly how it had been before. The whole storyline was erased as if it had never happened. This proved beyond any doubt that nothing in Family Guy could ever truly matter. If the show could kill off a main character and then casually undo it 3 episodes later, then literally anything could be undone. Death wasn't permanent. Consequences weren't real. The show existed in a bubble where nothing had weight or meaning. Sources point out that this approach can be frustrating for viewers to become invested in a storyline that doesn't matter. Why should audiences care about anything that happens if the show itself doesn't care? Why feel emotional about dramatic moments if those moments will be forgotten or reversed by the next episode? The status quo prison also killed any possibility of character development. In good television shows, characters change over the course of many seasons. They learn from their experiences, they grow as people, their relationships deepen and evolve. This character growth is what keeps long-running shows interesting. Even if you've seen hundreds of episodes, you keep watching to see how the characters continue to develop. Family Guy eliminated this completely. As sources note, the characters also have very little character development. They might go through some growth during the episode, but always return to be their old self. Peter Griffin in Season 20 is the same person as Peter Griffin in Season 10, who's the same person as Peter Griffin in Season 8. There's no arc, no journey, no reason to keep watching to see how Peter changes, because Peter never changes. This created a trap that the show couldn't escape. Once you establish that nothing matters and nothing changes, you can't suddenly make things matter again. Viewers have learned not to trust the show. When something dramatic happens, they know it will be undone or forgotten. They don't invest emotionally anymore, because they've been trained not to. The show tried to compensate for the lack of meaningful storytelling by relying more and more on gimmick episodes. Sources describe how Family Guy became oversaturated with episodes that deviate from the show's formula. These were episodes built around a single concept or style, rather than around actual character-driven stories. An episode called Send in Stewie Please is mentioned as an example of an episode that barely even has any jokes. The entire episode is Stewie talking to a therapist. It's a gimmick, a format experiment that exists because the writers couldn't think of a real story to tell. The show did more episodes as musicals, more episodes parodying entire movies, more episodes with special animation styles. In small doses, these experiments can be fun, but Family Guy started doing them so often that they stopped being special. The gimmicks became another way to avoid having to write actual stories with real character development. The cutaway gags, which had always been part of Family Guy's style, got completely out of control during this period. Sources note that cutaways were, quote, getting longer to basically waste time. Episodes would have cutaways that lasted a full minute or even longer, showing random scenes that had nothing to do with anything. The infamous Conway-Twitty cutaways became symbols of how lazy the writing had become. These were segments where the show would just play full, unedited performances by country singer Conway-Twitty. They weren't parodies. They weren't jokes. They were just footage of a real person singing a real song for 2 or 3 minutes. The first time Family Guy did a Conway-Twitty cutaway, it was weird and unexpected enough to be kind of funny. But the show kept doing them, over and over. By the 10th Conway-Twitty cutaway, it was just the writers admitting they couldn't write enough jokes to fill an episode, so they were using someone else's music to waste time. The show also started using more live-action footage instead of animation. Sources mentioned things like, the real-life profile picture of herpes in the episode Herpy the Love Sore. Instead of drawing things or creating animated versions, the show would just cut to real photographs or real video footage. This was lazy and broke the reality of the animated world the show had created. The status quo prison even affected how the show approached ongoing storylines about the characters' relationships. Peter and Lois's marriage is a perfect example. Sources note that their marriage has changed from shaky to outright broken, but that it never actually ends or improves. The relationship just exists in this perpetual state of dysfunction without ever resolving one way or the other. Early in the show's run, Peter and Lois had a loving relationship despite their problems. By later seasons, they barely seemed to like each other. Lois would openly mock Peter. Peter would ignore Lois or cheat on her. They treated each other terribly, but the show would never have them get divorced or go to counseling or actually address the problems in their marriage. Things just stayed bad forever. The same pattern affected plot recycling. Sources point out that Family Guy constantly repeated the same storylines over and over. Brian finding a girlfriend who just breaks up with them at the end happened in episode after episode after episode. The show had found formulas that sort of worked and just kept using them indefinitely. There were also repeated plots about Stewie and Brian time traveling together, and something fishy ensues, and Peter does something stupid at the start of the episode, which is completely forgotten about at the halfway point to make room for the other plot. These weren't variations on themes. They were literally the same stories, told multiple times with minor details changed. This recycling happened because the status quo prison made it impossible to tell new stories. If characters can't change and nothing can have lasting consequences, then you're limited in what kinds of stories you can tell. Eventually, you run out of ideas and start repeating yourself. In one particularly revealing example, sources mention an episode called Brian's a Bad Father, where the show cut a scene of Brian talking to his son Dylan in favor of unfunny cutaways. This shows the priorities clearly. The show had an opportunity to develop Brian's relationship with his son, to tell a story with real emotional stakes. Instead, they cut that scene and replaced it with random jokes that had nothing to do with anything. This decision perfectly captures what the status quo prison did to Family Guy. Any moment that might lead to character growth or meaningful change was removed. Anything that might make the show more than just a collection of random jokes was eliminated. The show became trapped in a formula where nothing could evolve or develop. The creative team behind Family Guy seemed to recognize this problem, at least on some level. The show started making meta jokes about its own lack of continuity and meaning. Characters would break the fourth wall to comment on how stupid the episode's plot was or how nothing made sense. The show was acknowledging its own problems but not fixing them. This meta-awareness didn't make the episodes better. If anything, it made them worse. Pointing out that your story is bad doesn't make it less bad. It just shows that you know you're making something terrible and you're doing it anyway. The status quo prison also meant the show couldn't take advantage of the huge library of episodes it had built up. With over 400 episodes produced across more than 20 seasons, Family Guy should have had rich history to draw from. Characters should have had decades of shared experiences to reference. Relationships should have been deep and complex after so many years together. But because nothing carried over from episode to episode, all those hundreds of episodes might as well not exist. The show couldn't call back to meaningful moments because there were no meaningful moments. Everything was disposable, forgettable, designed to be consumed and discarded. This stands in stark contrast to shows that embrace continuity and allow change. The Simpsons, for all its problems in later years, still references its own history. Characters on The Simpsons have gotten older, had life events, formed relationships that span hundreds of episodes. Even South Park, which mostly resets each episode, has had characters grow and change in permanent ways. Family Guy could have done the same thing. The show could have let Meg's character develop beyond being the family punching bag. It could have allowed Peter and Lois's marriage to evolve. It could have given Brian real consequences for his terrible behavior. It could have let Stewie fully transition from evil genius to whatever he was becoming. But that would have required the show to care about more than just getting easy laughs and filling time between commercial breaks. It would have required writers who wanted to tell stories rather than just string together random jokes. It would have required a creator who was still invested in the show's quality rather than just its profitability. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The status quo prison turned Family Guy into a show that couldn't grow, couldn't change, and couldn't matter. It was the opposite of what made television compelling. And yet, despite all of this, despite the terrible quality and declining ratings and creative bankruptcy, the show kept going, year after year after year. The The question of why reveals the final piece of Family Guy's tragic story. Section 12. The Fox Cash Cow. By every measure that matters for artistic quality, Family Guy should have been canceled years ago. The characters had been destroyed through Flanderization. The episodes were terrible and offensive. The ratings had collapsed from 7.9 million viewers to as low as 2.5 million. The creator had abandoned the show creatively. American Dad had proven there was a better way to do adult animation. Fans who once loved the show were walking away in huge numbers. And yet, Family Guy kept going. Season after season, year after year, the show continued producing new episodes. Fox kept renewing it. As of 2024, Family Guy has been renewed through season 23. The show has produced over 441 episodes across more than 2 decades. It shows no signs of stopping. The reason is simple and depressing: money. Family Guy is what people call a cash cow, meaning it generates huge profits regardless of quality. As long as the show makes money, Fox will keep it on the air. Quality doesn't matter. Artistic integrity doesn't matter. What the creator wants doesn't matter. All that matters is whether Family Guy continues to be profitable. And despite everything, despite the declining ratings and terrible reputation, Family Guy remains profitable. The show makes money through several sources. There's advertising revenue from commercials during new episodes. There's money from syndication deals where other networks pay to air reruns. There's merchandise like t-shirts, toys, and video games. There are streaming deals with services like Hulu that pay for the rights to host the show. All of this adds up to millions of dollars in profit every year. Even with reduced viewership, Family Guy brings in enough money to justify its continued existence from Fox's perspective. The network has invested over 20 years and hundreds of millions of dollars into the show. They're not going to walk away from that investment as long as it keeps generating returns. Sources specifically state that Fox is still airing the show to this day due to it being considered their cash cow despite the declining ratings. The network knows the show isn't good anymore. They know the ratings are bad. They don't care. The profit margins are what matter. This creates an impossible situation for everyone involved. Seth MacFarlane has been open about wanting to end Family Guy for years. In 2013, he said, "I prayed to God every night that it would be 10 years and out." That would have meant ending the show around 2009, right when the quality started collapsing. MacFarlane saw the problems coming and wanted to end on a high note. But sources indicate that MacFarlane originally wanted the show to end, but Fox forced him to keep it going. The network owns Family Guy. They have the legal right to keep producing it as long as MacFarlane fulfills his contract to voice the characters. MacFarlane can't just walk away, even though he wants to. This explains why MacFarlane checked out creatively while continuing to voice Peter, Stewie, Brian, and Quagmire. He's contractually obligated to show up and record his lines, but nobody can force him to care about the quality of the scripts he's reading. So he doesn't. He treats it as a job, shows up, does his work, and collects his paycheck. The situation during the 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild strike shows how little control MacFarlane actually has. According to sources, Fox aired 3 Family Guy episodes behind MacFarlane's back during the strike. The network broadcasted episodes that the creators hadn't approved for airing. This was Fox's way of establishing dominance, of showing that they controlled Family Guy regardless of what its creator wanted. MacFarlane never forgot that betrayal. It showed him clearly that Fox saw Family Guy as their property to do with as they pleased. If the network was willing to go behind his back and air episodes during a strike, they certainly weren't going to let him end the show just because he thought it was time. In 2024, MacFarlane's comments about Family Guy's future revealed his current thinking. He said, "At this point, we've reached escape velocity. I don't know that there's any reason to stop at this point unless people get sick of it. Unless the numbers show that people just are, we don't care about Family Guy anymore." But that hasn't happened yet. This statement is important for what it reveals. MacFarlane isn't saying the show should continue because it's still good, or because he has stories he wants to tell. He's saying it should continue because people still watch it, and it still makes money. He's accepted that quality is irrelevant. The show will continue until it stops being profitable, period. MacFarlane was even more direct about the financial motivations. He explained that Family Guy makes a lot of extraneous cash that you can donate to Rainforest Trust, and you can still go out to dinner that night. The show generates so much money that MacFarlane can donate large sums to environmental charities and still have plenty left over for himself. This is an honest admission. Family Guy continues because it funds Seth MacFarlane's lifestyle and charitable giving. The show is a money machine that requires minimal effort from him. He shows up for a few hours every few weeks to record voices. He doesn't have to write scripts or make creative decisions or even pay attention to what's happening in episodes. And for this limited work, he makes millions of dollars per year. From McFarlane's perspective, why would he push to end that arrangement? Yes, he'd like Family Guy to be good again. Yes, he wishes he could end it with dignity, but those desires aren't strong enough to make him give up millions of dollars in easy money. The people who work on Family Guy day to day have their own reasons for wanting it to continue. The showrunners, writers, animators, and voice actors all have stable, well-paying jobs because of the show. For them, Family Guy ending would mean unemployment and having to find new work. Alex Sulkin, one of Family Guy's co-showrunners, joked that the only real concern about the show's future is McFarlane's vocal cords. At 50 years old, McFarlane acknowledged that recording voices for multiple characters across multiple shows takes a physical toll, but as long as his voice holds up, there's no reason the show can't continue indefinitely. The other voice actors have expressed similar sentiments. Seth Green, who voices Chris Griffin, said, "I would be so sad if ever there was a reason for this to stop, because it is endless amounts of fun." Alex Borstein, who voices Lois Griffin, said, "I feel like every time we have a table read or recording, I'm laughing. For me, that's my litmus test." These are nice sentiments, and it's good that the actors still enjoy their work. But they also have financial incentives to want the show to continue. Voice acting on a long-running, successful show is an incredibly cushy job. You work a few hours every few weeks and make excellent money. Nobody wants that to end. What's missing from all of these discussions is any mention of the audience. McFarlane talks about the show funding his charitable donations. The showrunners talk about it being fun to make. The voice actors talk about laughing at table reads. Nobody talks about whether the show is actually good for the people watching it. The millions of viewers who abandoned Family Guy over the years voted with their time and attention. They were telling everyone involved that the show had become bad and they didn't want to watch it anymore. But that message doesn't matter because the show is still profitable despite losing those viewers. This is the ultimate consequence of treating television as nothing more than a business. When profit is the only measure of success, quality becomes irrelevant. Family Guy can be terrible, offensive, lazy, and creatively bankrupt, and it doesn't matter as long as enough people still watch to generate advertising revenue. Fox has a huge financial investment in Family Guy that goes beyond just producing new episodes. The network owns the syndication rights, meaning they make money every time any episode airs on any channel anywhere in the world. They own the merchandise rights, they own the streaming rights. Family Guy is a valuable piece of intellectual property that generates passive income even when no new episodes are being made. From Fox's perspective, keeping Family Guy alive is a no-brainer. The show has 441 episodes in its library. Those episodes can be rerun endlessly on cable channels and streaming services. They can be packaged and sold as DVD sets. They can be licensed to international markets. All of this generates money without requiring Fox to do anything except own the rights. The status quo becomes God in this situation, which is a phrase that means keeping things exactly as they are benefits everyone who makes money from the show. Fox doesn't want Family Guy to end or change because the current arrangement is profitable. McFarlane doesn't push for changes because he gets paid either way. The showrunners and writers don't rock the boat because they want to keep their jobs. This explains why Family Guy became trapped in the status quo prison we discussed in the previous section. If the show never changes, never takes risks, never does anything that might upset the formula, then it can continue generating reliable profits indefinitely. Change is risky. Change might fail and hurt ratings even more. Better to just keep doing the same thing over and over, even if that thing is terrible. The show has become what sources describe as unwatchable for many former fans. People who once loved Family Guy can't stand to watch it anymore. The show they fell in love with is gone, replaced by something mean-spirited, lazy, and joyless. But those former fans don't matter to Fox, because enough other people still watch to keep the advertising money flowing. This is perhaps the saddest part of Family Guy's story. The show isn't dead because dead things stop moving. Family Guy is still on the air, still producing episodes, still making money, but it's not really alive either. It's a zombie, a corpse that keeps walking through sheer momentum and financial incentive. The show that survived 2 cancellations through the sheer passion of its fan base has become a cautionary tale about what happens when profit becomes the only goal. The show that once pushed boundaries and took creative risks has become the safest, most predictable thing imaginable, because safety generates reliable profits. Family Guy proved that a show could be brought back from cancellation through DVD sales and fan support. But it also proved that success can be its own curse. If the show had stayed canceled in 2002, it would be remembered fondly as a quirky comedy that died too soon. Instead, it will be remembered as a show that overstayed its welcome by more than a decade, that destroyed its own characters and reputation, and that chose money over quality at every possible opportunity. Seth MacFarlane created something special with the first few seasons of Family Guy. The early episodes had heart, creativity, and genuine humor. The golden age after the revival showed what the show could be at its best. But all of that has been buried under years of terrible episodes, Flanderized characters, and cynical cash grabs. The death of Family Guy isn't a single event. It's a slow process that's been happening for over a decade. The show died creatively years ago when McFarlane checked out and the writers stopped caring about quality. It died artistically when the characters were Flanderized beyond recognition. It died commercially when millions of viewers abandoned it. But Fox won't let it die officially because there's still money to be extracted from the corpse. So Family Guy continues, renewed season after season, producing episode after episode that fewer and fewer people watch or care about. The show that once defined a generation of adult animation has become a punchline, a symbol of everything that can go wrong when television becomes nothing more than a business. And perhaps that's the real legacy of Family Guy. Not the clever jokes from the early seasons, or the heartfelt Brian and Stewie adventures, or the audacity of surviving cancellation. The legacy is a warning. This is what happens when you let profit become the only measure of success. This is what happens when a creator abandons his creation but won't let it die. This is what happens when a network values money over art. Family Guy is dead. It died years ago, but nobody will admit it. Nobody will mourn it properly, and nobody will bury it. The show just keeps lurching forward, a zombie animated by money rather than creativity, serving as a monument to everything that went wrong and everything that could have been. So did Family Guy really die? Looking at everything we've covered, the answer is undeniably yes. The show died years ago, but unlike most deaths, this one happened slowly, in pieces, while the body kept moving. We started with a show that had genuine promise. Family Guy premiered in 1999, with heart, creativity, and characters who felt real despite being cartoons. Peter was dumb but caring. Brian had depth beyond pretentiousness. The family actually seemed to like each other. The show survived 2 cancellations and came back stronger than ever, proving that good content could overcome network mismanagement. Then came the golden age, from 2005 to 2009, when Family Guy showed what it could be at its absolute best. The Road 2 episodes gave us adventure and emotion. The storytelling balanced crude humor with genuine heart. The show averaged nearly 8 million viewers and earned its place as one of the most important animated comedies on television. But Season 8 marked the tipping point. This is where Seth MacFarlane stepped back from day-to-day involvement, where Peter's stupidity crossed from funny to disturbing, where the characters started their transformation into one-dimensional caricatures. Every major character suffered catastrophic Flanderization. Peter became a psychopathic man-child. Brian became nothing but smugness. Meg became just a punching bag. The people we'd cared about for years disappeared, replaced by hollow shells that only resembled the original characters. South Park saw what was happening and called it out in 2006 with the manatees joke. They explained exactly why Family Guy's writing was lazy and terrible, and writers from The Simpsons and King of the Hill thanked them for finally saying it publicly. The criticism was devastating because it was accurate, and Family Guy's continued decline proved South Park right. The controversial episodes era from 2010 to 2014 showed just how far the show had fallen. Episodes like Seahorse Seashell Party, Fresh Air, and the death and resurrection of Brian weren't just bad television. They were evidence of a show that had lost any sense of boundaries, taste, or purpose. The writers were making content purely for shock value, with no thought to whether it was actually funny or meaningful. While all this was happening, Seth MacFarlane admitted he hadn't worked directly on the show in 15 years. The creator checked out, leaving Family Guy to run on autopilot while he cashed checks and worked on projects he actually cared about. Meanwhile, American Dad demonstrated that MacFarlane could still make quality adult animation when he was actually involved, which made Family Guy's failures even more inexcusable. The ratings collapsed from nearly 8 million viewers to as low as 2.5 million. Fans abandoned the show in massive numbers, voting with their time and attention that they were done watching something that had become unwatchable. The status quo prison meant nothing could change, nothing could matter, and nothing could have consequences. Characters couldn't grow. Stories couldn't evolve. The show became trapped in a formula that prevented it from being anything except a collection of random jokes. And through it all, Fox kept renewing Family Guy season after season because it remained profitable. Quality didn't matter. Viewer satisfaction didn't matter. Artistic integrity didn't matter. All that mattered was money. Family Guy became a cash cow that Fox would milk until the very last drop, regardless of how terrible the show became. This is why Family Guy's story matters. It's a warning about what happens when profit becomes the only measure of success. It shows what happens when a creator abandons his creation, but won't let it die with dignity. It demonstrates how Flanderization can destroy beloved characters, and how a lack of consequences can drain all meaning from storytelling. Family Guy didn't fail because animated comedy is inherently limited, or because shows can't maintain quality for many years. American Dad proved those things weren't true. Family Guy failed because the people making it stopped caring about anything except making money. They chose easy over good, safe over creative, profitable over meaningful. The show that defied cancellation through fan passion became a zombie, kept alive by corporate greed. The comedy that once had heart became mean-spirited and joyless. The characters we loved became monsters, and the creator who built it all walked away while pretending everything was fine. Family Guy is dead. It has been for over a decade, but nobody will admit it. Nobody will mourn it properly, and nobody will bury it. The corpse just keeps walking, producing episode after episode that fewer people watch or care about, serving as a monument to wasted potential and the dangers of putting profit above art. That's the real death of Family Guy. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.